Hello, my dear friends. They powdered themselves with arsenic, bathed in the same tub of dirty water, hid blood-stained wedding gowns in closets for decades. These weren't peasants in the woods. These were the high society women of Victorian London, under lace, silk, and perfume. There was rot, a world where hygiene was dangerous, and silence even deadlier, where infections wore petticoats and secrets slept between soiled sheets. Tonight, let us slip past the velvet curtains and uncover what really festered beneath the elegance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If cleanliness was meant to be a measure of respectability in Victorian homes, it was not the kind of cleanliness we would recognise today. For many women, the idea of immersing themselves in water was tied to fear rather than refreshment. Medical voices of the time warned that too much bathing would weaken the body, open the pores, and let in sickness. Mothers repeated this to their daughters, reinforcing the belief that water itself carried danger. So instead of stepping into tubs, women reached for bottles of alcohol, dipping cloths in spirits and rubbing them across their skin. The ritual seemed to promise health, but it left behind little more than the sharp scent of liquor and the illusion of being clean. The practice of wiping with alcohol became part of weekly rhythm. Women pressed damp cloths over their armpits, across their chest, or around the folds of their bodies. The sting of the liquid was accepted as proof that it was working, even though the deeper dirt remained. Areas like the legs and feet were often ignored, left hidden beneath heavy stockings and layers of fabric. To admit that such places needed attention would have been considered indecent, almost as if acknowledging them risked inviting shame. What passed for hygiene was really an exercise in restraint, where appearances mattered more than actual health. It is almost laughable that a culture prided itself on refinement, while women went months without truly washing their bodies. Magazines recommended this method with confidence, encouraging women to use scented alcohols as though they were luxury cosmetics. Lavender water or rose spirits were common, giving the impression of freshness even as grime built up. The damp cloths did little to remove sweat or oils, but the fragrance concealed what could not be erased. Servants were sometimes ordered to prepare the cloths, turning what should have been an intimate act of cleansing into yet another performance of status. The higher the social class, the more elaborate the scents used, but the effect was the same surface-level purity masking hidden neglect. In many households, bathing with water was reserved for the ill, as if sickness alone justified such an extreme measure. When someone is burned with fever, a doctor might suggest sponging them with cool water. Yet for healthy women, the routine stayed firmly tied to alcohol wipes. This paradox reinforced the belief that water was dangerous unless supervised by authority. It also made bathing into a spectacle, something unusual rather than ordinary. The result was a society where women were praised for restraint even as their health quietly suffered. Daily life left its marks on the body. Dust from streets clung to skirts and stockings. Smoke from coal fires settled into hair and skin, and sweat gathered beneath the tight corsets that pressed against the torso. But instead of removing these layers, women dabbed at them with alcohol and powder, hoping no one would notice. The smell of spirits became as common in parlours as perfume, mingling with the must of unwashed fabric. Compared to modern routines, where showers are expected every morning, the Victorian reliance on alcohol cloths feels both alien and disturbingly inadequate. There was also a social element to this ritual. Women might sit together preparing their clothes, comparing fragrances, or sharing recipes for homemade alcohol mixtures. In that sense, the act of wiping became part of social bonding, but it remained rooted in ignorance. Knowledge about bacteria was still developing, and most households never considered what lingered on the surface of skin. Spirits killed some germs, but without water, the cleansing was incomplete. What was celebrated as sophistication was in fact a fragile mask, easily broken by the realities of dirt and disease. Servants bore the burden of this culture as well. They were often tasked with handling soiled cloths, wringing them out, and preparing fresh ones. The proximity to their mistresses' bodies exposed them to sweat, secretions, and the residue of illness. Yet they had no choice but to obey, their own cleanliness dismissed as less important. I find myself unsettled by the thought of these women maintaining an appearance of purity through rituals that were far more punishing than protective. Medical professionals occasionally raised doubts, noting that the overuse of alcohol dried the skin and caused irritation. Women complained of redness, itching, or sores, yet continued the practice because alternatives were viewed as riskier. Doctors themselves were often complicit, prescribing mixtures of spirits and herbs as tonics for the skin. What should have been a warning became reinforcement, further embedding the belief that alcohol was safer than water. The ritual also shaped how women experienced their own bodies. The act of wiping rather than bathing kept them distant from the reality of their skin, never fully engaging with the parts most in need of care. It reduced hygiene to something superficial, disconnected from health. The body was treated not as a living system but as an object to be perfumed, hidden, and restrained. Beneath the surface, infections could grow unnoticed, shielded by the fragrance of lavender or rose. This cycle of neglect illustrates the contradictions of the age. A society that idolized purity also embraced practices that left its women vulnerable. The very tools used to protect appearances worked against genuine health. What mattered was not the removal of dirt, but the performance of refinement, a performance that could be exhausting and dangerous. The reliance on alcohol cloths is a reminder that cultural ideals often demand sacrifices, and those sacrifices fall hardest on those with the least power to resist. The truth is that the Victorian ritual of wiping with alcohol did little more than spread the scent of spirits across unwashed skin. It was a habit rooted in fear, sustained by tradition, and enforced by social pressure. Women lived within this cycle because stepping outside of it meant risking judgment, whispers, or exclusion. To question it openly was almost unthinkable, and so the practice endured for generations. The paradox of a society obsessed with purity, yet afraid of water, reveals the depth of Victorian anxieties. Purity was not about health, but about control, a way of ensuring women remained bound to certain behaviours. In that context, alcohol cloths were not just a method of cleansing, but a symbol of restraint. They kept women quiet, compliant, and seemingly respectable, even as the reality of their bodies told a different story. In the end, alcohol replaced water, fragrance replaced hygiene, and appearances replaced truth. The result was a culture where women carried the marks of neglect hidden under their gowns, convinced they were preserving virtue when they were only preserving dirt. This contradiction sits at the heart of Victorian life, where the fear of being judged outweighs the desire to be well. Women wiped themselves with spirits, not water, convinced it kept them pure while their bodies remained unwashed. This avoidance of bathing was a sign of restraint celebrated by their society. Yet beneath the perfumes and alcohol lay a darker habit, the reluctance to change undergarments that clung to their skin until filth made them unbearable. Undergarments in Victorian society were rarely treated as garments meant for cleanliness. Instead, they were considered burdensome objects that clung to the body for days, sometimes weeks, without proper washing. Most were made of heavy fabrics like wool or coarse linen, materials that trapped sweat, oils, and waste but were difficult to launder. The weight of the cloth itself discouraged frequent cleaning, and women came to accept that constant reuse was simply the way things were. What should have been the most intimate layer of clothing became a silent carrier of filth, tolerated because removing it too often was seen as unnecessary. The practice of wearing the same undergarments for extended periods was tied to the difficulty of washing them. Without modern detergents or washing machines, cleaning these thick fabrics required hours of soaking, scrubbing, and drying. Many families avoided this work, leaving garments to wear outside in the sun rather than attempting full washes. Sunlight was believed to purify what water and soap could not. As a result, undergarments became stiff with dried sweat and discoloured from repeated wear. It is almost comical to imagine women of high social rank spraying perfume on these items and believing they were restored to freshness. Perfume was the most common substitute for laundering. Women would spray or sprinkle scent directly onto fabric, masking odours while ignoring the stains. Rosewater, lavender, or other fragrant mixtures covered the surface, yet the cloth beneath remained soiled. In wealthier households, servants were sometimes instructed to fan the garments in the open air, letting the wind carry away smells while the dirt stayed in place. This ritual created the impression of cleanliness, but the evidence of use was always visible. Yellow or brown stains were accepted as normal, treated not as signs of neglect but as an unavoidable part of life. The reluctance to wash undergarments also reflected cultural anxieties. To acknowledge the dirtiness of intimate clothing was to admit to the existence of bodily functions, something Victorians preferred not to discuss. Women were expected to act as though their bodies were free from such realities, as though modesty alone kept them pure. The undergarment thus became both a symbol of silence and a tool of concealment. Worn until it was undeniably filthy, it remained hidden beneath layers of outer skirts, out of sight but never truly clean. This neglect had obvious consequences for health. Moisture and warmth trapped in thick fabric created perfect conditions for infections, rashes, and skin diseases. Doctors of the time occasionally noted cases of chronic irritation or sores, yet rarely connected them to clothing habits. Women endured discomfort in silence, reluctant to raise such matters even in private consultations. To admit that undergarments caused illness risked being judged as indecent, so the garments stayed on, generation after generation, carrying the marks of sweat and secretions that no perfume could erase. Compared to today, when daily changes of underwear are considered basic hygiene, the Victorian tolerance of long-term use feels unthinkable. Families with limited means faced even greater hardship. For poorer women, owning only a few sets of undergarments meant rotating them endlessly. When one set became too dirty, it was aired out while another equally worn piece was put on. Washing was done sparingly to save labour and water, leaving garments in a constant state of partial cleanliness. The lack of privacy in crowded housing made laundering even less appealing, since others could see the stains and judge harshly. Poverty amplified the shame, but even among the wealthy, the core habit remained the same. Social customs reinforced this cycle. Magazines emphasized the importance of outer appearance but rarely mentioned what lay beneath. Women were encouraged to maintain the elegance of gowns, gloves, and hats, while the hidden layers were ignored. The neglect was invisible to the public eye, and therefore it was excused. The double standard was clear: what could be displayed received attention, while what was intimate was dismissed. Hygiene was shaped not by health, but by visibility. Servants once again carried part of the burden. They were often the ones to handle these garments, shaking them out, dabbing them with perfume, or folding them away. The task exposed them to residues of sweat, menstrual blood, and bodily fluids. Yet their discomfort was irrelevant to the households they served. They too became silent participants in maintaining the illusion of purity, complicit not by choice but by necessity. I cannot help but find it disturbing to imagine these women handling layers of fabric soiled with stains considered normal by those who wore them. The absence of proper cleaning practices also influenced how women thought about their own health. Discomfort became normalized, irritation accepted as part of daily life. To complain risked sounding weak or improper, so most chose silence. Over time, this silence hardened into cultural expectation. It was assumed that women should endure without question, and that their role was to preserve appearances rather than pursue comfort. Undergarments, meant to protect, instead became instruments of quiet suffering. This habit reveals the contradictions of Victorian values. Outwardly, society demanded refinement and morality. Inwardly, it tolerated neglect so long as it remained hidden. Perfume was not a solution, but it allowed families to claim cleanliness without doing the work required. The stains themselves became proof of endurance, a testimony to how women were expected to carry discomfort without complaint. Such endurance was celebrated as a virtue, even though it brought only harm. The cycle repeated itself across generations. Mothers taught daughters to air out their garments and to rely on perfume, passing down the belief that stains were unavoidable and unremarkable. What should have been a matter of hygiene became a matter of tradition. Breaking from that tradition was nearly impossible, for it required challenging both social expectations and family customs. And so the garments remained, bearing silent witness to a culture that confused neglect with propriety. In truth, the undergarments of Victorian women were less a shield of modesty and more a reservoir of neglect. They trapped the realities of the body and carried them forward day after day, unwashed and disguised with fragrance. The stains were not accidents, but the predictable result of a culture unwilling to face its own contradictions. To call this cleanliness was to mistake appearance for reality, a mistake repeated endlessly in parlours, bedrooms, and laundry rooms across the century. Victorian women wore their undergarments until dirt forced change, believing fragrance could replace true washing. The practice spoke less of cleanliness and more of denial. Yet beneath those heavy layers lay another habit just as troubling: the treatment of hair as something to be styled daily but rarely, if ever, cleansed. Hair was a marker of femininity in Victorian culture, yet the way it was treated revealed more about appearances than about hygiene. Women prided themselves on having thick, elaborate hairstyles, pinned and curled into place each morning, but the truth behind the polish was far less refined. Shampooing as we know it did not exist, and washing hair with water was viewed with suspicion. Instead, powders and scented dusts were rubbed into the scalp to absorb oils and disguise odour. The result was hair that appeared dressed and orderly, while beneath the surface it remained greasy, tangled, and unhealthy. The daily ritual of grooming centred not on washing but on brushing. Wooden combs and brushes passed through strands again and again, collecting flakes of dandruff, clumps of oil, and loose hairs that clung to the bristles. These tools were rarely cleaned, turning them into storehouses of filth that transferred residue back to the scalp each morning. Still, the act of brushing was praised as a symbol of refinement, a mark of discipline and care. It is difficult not to smirk at the irony of calling hair polished when the same comb carried weeks of accumulated grime. Powders were central to this illusion, scented with lavender, rose, or even plain starch. They left a pale residue that clung to roots. This residue mixed with sweat and oils, forming a thick layer that suffocated the scalp. Some women experimented with dyes containing lead or copper salts, substances that caused burns, rashes, or worse. Yet these dangers were overlooked in favour of maintaining an appearance of fashionable colour. Hair became both a canvas for style and a silent carrier of poison. Water was avoided out of fear that wetting the head could invite illness. Physicians warned that cold water on the scalp weakened the nerves, and families took this warning seriously. A woman who dared to rinse her hair risked gossip or reprimand. Instead, she was encouraged to add more powder, to brush more thoroughly, or to wrap her head in cloth at night. What developed was not a practice of cleanliness, but a cycle of concealment, where filth was hidden under layers of fragrance and fabric. The neglect of true washing bred visible consequences. Scalps became inflamed and covered with sores from constant irritation. Lice and nits flourished in the warm, unwashed environment, spreading quickly among households where brushes were shared. Women complained of itching but rarely admitted the cause, attributing discomfort to heat or seasonal changes. Compared to today, when washing hair a few times a week is considered normal, the Victorian approach seems closer to avoidance than to grooming. Society nevertheless upheld the practice as respectable. Ladies' journals described the importance of brushing hair 100 strokes each night, praising it as both beautifying and moral. The glow of well-brushed hair was celebrated, while the unseen accumulation of filth went unmentioned. To challenge the custom would have been to challenge the very definition of refinement. The pressure to conform meant that women participated willingly, brushing faithfully even as their hair became heavy with residue. Servants again carried much of the responsibility. Maids stood behind their mistresses each evening, comb in hand, enduring the flakes and oils that fell onto their aprons. The close contact exposed them to the same infestations that thrived on their employers' scalps. Yet their labour was described not as hazardous, but as an act of loyalty, another invisible sacrifice demanded by a culture obsessed with appearances. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining a servant forced to brush through clumps of greasy hair, knowing her own health was at risk. The culture of hair neglect also influenced how illness was understood. Medical accounts occasionally recorded outbreaks of scalp disease in entire households, yet the language used rarely pointed to hygiene. Instead, such conditions were described as misfortune or weakness of constitution. This framing protected social norms, ensuring that no one had to admit the connection between unwashed hair and spreading disease. Silence once more replaced honesty, allowing problems to persist. Even when washing did occur, it was far from effective. Some women poured small amounts of beer, vinegar, or even urine over their heads, believing these liquids strengthened hair. These treatments left behind their own odours and residues, yet were passed down as trusted remedies. Actual rinsing with clean water was the rarest choice, reserved for those who rejected prevailing fears. The few who dared often faced ridicule, their habits labelled unladylike or reckless. The contradiction was glaring. A society that placed such value on polished hairstyles ignored the filth required to sustain them. The elegance of curls and braids existed only because water was kept away, a sacrifice of hygiene for beauty. Women lived within this contradiction daily, smiling through gatherings while their scalps itched beneath layers of powder. For many, it must have been a silent misery, endured because to complain would risk appearing improper. In the end, Victorian hair care was less about health than about maintaining illusions. The powders, the brushing, the elaborate styles, all were meant to signal refinement while concealing neglect. Disease spread easily through these habits, yet the culture insisted on their virtue. To call it grooming was to mistake ritual for cleanliness, a mistake repeated every morning and every night across the century. Victorian women brushed their hair faithfully, powdered it with fragrance and avoided water as if it were poison. This created hair that looked composed but concealed dirt and disease. Behind those carefully styled locks, however, lay an even more troubling reality. The way untreated scalps became breeding grounds for infestations that spread silently through entire households. Hair that was never properly washed did not simply remain dirty, it became a vessel for contagion. The scalp, heavy with oils and powders, created the perfect environment for parasites. Lice thrived in the dense layers of unclean hair, leaving behind eggs that clung tightly to strands. Each brush stroke carried the insects further, from one section of hair to another, and from mistress to servant. What looked like the careful maintenance of beauty concealed a breeding ground for disease. The illusion of refinement was maintained in the drawing room, while the reality of infection spread quietly in the bedchamber. The problem was not only lice. Fungal infections took root on damp, irritated scalps, causing red patches, sores, and peeling skin. The absence of water meant that such infections had little chance of healing. Instead, Powders and oils added more layers to the already inflamed surface, trapping heat and moisture. The constant brushing, intended to signal elegance, opened scratches that worsened the condition. For women in close quarters with maids or children, the infection spread rapidly, moving from head to head with alarming ease. It is almost absurd to think that households so obsessed with outward propriety ignored the infestations crawling openly through their hair. Medical records from the period occasionally noted such cases, though the language was often softened. Physicians described scalp irritation or general decline rather than naming lice or fungal infection outright. Respectable families preferred vague terms, since acknowledging parasites would stain their reputation. This reluctance allowed conditions to worsen unchecked, turning simple infestations into severe infections. Women suffered in silence, unwilling to risk social humiliation by admitting what was happening on their own heads. Servants bore the brunt of these outbreaks. Standing behind their mistresses, comb in hand, they brushed through clumps of hair that hid crawling insects. It was common for maids to develop the same conditions, their scalps erupting in sores after weeks of exposure. Yet their suffering was invisible, dismissed as an occupational hazard. The division of class ensured that the women most affected were also those least able to speak about it. Compared to today, when a simple shampoo can eliminate lice, the Victorian tolerance of these infestations seems both reckless and cruel. The odour of unwashed hair compounded the problem. A mixture of sweat, oils, powders, and infection produced a stench described in some journals as sour or metallic. Women attempted to disguise it with perfumes, but the combination only created sharper, more pungent smells. In gatherings, the scent hung in the air, unacknowledged but undeniable. Visitors might notice the odour but politely pretend otherwise, unwilling to pierce the illusion of refinement. Silence, once again, proved more important than truth. Children were not spared from these conditions. In wealthy homes, young girls often shared brushes or sat for the same hairdressers as their mothers. Infestations passed easily between them, leaving entire families scratching at their scalps. The infections worsened during the winter months, when closed windows and heavy fabrics kept the air damp and stagnant. Even then, bathing was rarely considered an option. Instead, families relied on powders, only adding to the layers of grime that kept parasites thriving. The danger extended beyond discomfort. Open sores on the scalp could become infected with bacteria, leading to swelling, fever, and, in some cases, systemic illness. Medical notes occasionally recorded deaths attributed to fever of unknown origin that may well have begun with untreated scalp conditions. The unwillingness to admit the true cause meant that preventable tragedies were recorded as mysteries. Families buried not just the victims but also the evidence of neglect that had led to their deaths. I cannot help but feel unsettled by the thought of women maintaining elaborate hairstyles, while infections festered beneath the pins and powders. The cultural obsession with appearance ensured that even these outbreaks were reinterpreted. Red patches on the scalp might be hidden with new styles, or blamed on seasonal dryness rather than infestation. Hairdressers, eager to please clients, recommended more powders or tighter braids, further aggravating the condition. The cycle of concealment and worsening illness became self-perpetuating. To question it would have been to risk ostracism, and so most women endured quietly, even as their heads burned with pain and irritation. This silence allowed the problem to move beyond households and into the broader community. Schools, churches, and social gatherings all became places where infestation spread unnoticed. Women carried parasites into drawing rooms, infecting others as they embraced or shared seats. Children brought them to classrooms, where they passed freely among classmates. The very structures meant to uphold morality and social order became conduits for hidden disease. In truth, unwashed hair was not simply a sign of personal neglect, but a threat to public health. It carried infestations, odours, and infections that spread far beyond the individual. Yet Victorian culture preferred to ignore this reality, clinging to the illusion of purity even as parasites thrived in silence. The contradiction was cruel. A society that demanded restraint from women also forced them to endure conditions that endangered their health. Appearance mattered more than well-being, and the result was predictable misery. The sight of polished hairstyles in portraits hides the truth of what those styles contained. Beneath the powders and pins lived colonies of lice and layers of sores, reminders of a culture unwilling to face its own contradictions. What looked elegant in the mirror was, in reality, a fragile mask covering disease. To live under such conditions was to accept suffering as part of propriety, an expectation forced on women without reprieve. Victorian women carried infestations on their heads while pretending to embody refinement. Their silence allowed these conditions to spread unchecked, leaving behind both misery and hidden tragedy. As their scalps burned with infection, their gowns bore stains of another kind, reminders of how bodily functions were treated with the same denial that kept their hair unwashed. Long dresses in the Victorian era were praised as the pinnacle of modesty and refinement, but their length carried with it a hidden filth that few were willing to acknowledge. As women walked through streets lined with horse droppings, mud, and refuse, the hems of their skirts dragged across the ground, collecting layers of grime. Each step brought new contaminants, clinging to fabric that would later brush against their skin and their homes. What looked like elegance was, in practice, a sponge for the waste of the city. This problem grew even worse when women faced the natural realities of their own bodies, which Victorian culture preferred to ignore rather than address. During menstruation, women were provided with few options. The common method was to fold a piece of woolen or linen cloth and tuck it discreetly beneath their layers of undergarments. These makeshift pads were rarely changed throughout the day, both because of the inconvenience and because speaking of menstruation was considered indecent. With no elastic or proper undergarments to hold them securely, the clothes often slipped, leaving stains that spread onto the outer skirts. The lack of modern underwear meant that menstrual blood soaked directly into the same gowns that had already gathered dirt from the streets. It is grimly ironic that women who were expected to appear pure and untouched were forced to walk around in garments literally steeped in waste. The weight of these dresses made the situation worse, heavy with multiple layers of fabric, including petticoats and underskirts. They absorbed and retained moisture. On rainy days, hems dragged through puddles that mixed water with sewage and animal droppings. When combined with menstrual blood, the result was a toxic blend of filth pressed close to the body for hours or even days. Women often had no choice but to endure the discomfort, maintaining composure in parlours and drawing rooms while their clothing grew heavier with each passing moment. The act of sitting down could smear this mixture further, embedding it into upholstery or seeping into underlayers. Laundry was no easy solution. Gowns were costly and elaborate, often made of silks, velvets, and wools that could not withstand frequent washing. Most dresses were never fully laundered, only brushed or aired out to remove surface dirt. Stains, once embedded, became permanent. Blood left rusty marks. Urine created yellow patches, and the constant contact with street waste left streaks of grime that no amount of perfume could disguise. Instead of discarding these dresses, women wore them repeatedly, layering new stains over old. Compared to modern life, where a single mishap leads to immediate washing, the Victorian willingness to wear stained clothing again and again feels shocking. Servants carried an additional burden in this cycle of neglect. They were responsible for handling gowns that reeked of both street filth and bodily fluids, tasked with brushing away dirt without damaging delicate fabrics. Many complained of rashes and skin irritations from contact with soiled cloth, yet their voices were rarely recorded. To them, it was just another duty, invisible to the world above stairs. Their labour preserved the illusion of refinement while exposing them to risks their mistresses could ignore. I cannot help but feel a sense of unease when imagining women draped in gowns that looked regal from afar but were in truth saturated with waste. The smell was another hidden reality. Menstrual blood trapped in heavy fabric developed a sour odour, which mixed with the sharp stench of urine and the earthy scent of mud. Perfume was the preferred disguise, sprayed liberally onto skirts and undergarments. Yet this only produced a sharper, more complex odour, one that lingered in rooms and carriages long after the women had left. Visitors were too polite to comment, but the discomfort must have been common knowledge. The silence around such matters served only to protect reputations, never to improve conditions. This silence extended to medicine as well. Doctors rarely wrote openly about menstrual hygiene, preferring euphemisms or avoiding the subject entirely. Women were expected to handle it themselves, guided by whispered advice from mothers or older relatives. Many believed that bathing during menstruation was harmful, so washing was avoided when it was most needed. The result was predictable infections became commonplace, yet were never attributed to their true cause. Women endured fevers, rashes, and chronic illnesses while the connection between health and hygiene remained buried beneath layers of taboo. The streets themselves worsened the cycle. Horse manure was everywhere, and long skirts ensured constant contact. Even women from the wealthiest families, riding in carriages or walking with parasols, could not avoid the contamination. Their dresses acted like nets, gathering the detritus of urban life and carrying it indoors. Once inside, those same skirts brushed against furniture, rugs, and bedding, spreading dirt throughout the home. In this way, the garments became vectors for disease, linking the public filth of the streets with the supposed sanctity of the household. Children were especially at risk. Mothers carrying infants or holding children in their laps often transferred contaminants directly from their skirts onto young bodies. Infants pressed against stained fabric might develop skin conditions or infections, yet the cause was rarely acknowledged. Instead, sickness was blamed on weak constitutions or the hazards of city air. The true culprit, the untreated fabric soaked in bodily fluids and street waste, remained invisible in polite conversation. The danger was not confined to the poor or the careless. Even queens and noblewomen faced the same limitations. Lavish gowns did not protect against the realities of menstruation or the filth of the streets. Accounts from ladies in waiting sometimes hint at the discomfort of court, where long hours of ceremony were endured in dresses heavy with hidden stains. Yet to mention this openly would have been unthinkable. In a world where reputation was everything, silence was valued more than truth, no matter the cost to health. The contradictions of this culture are hard to ignore. Women were praised as paragons of purity while forced to live in garments saturated with dirt and blood. They were admired for their elegance, yet that elegance came at the cost of hygiene and comfort. Society demanded composure, but composure came at the expense of health. This cruel balance ensured that suffering remained private, endured behind smiles and perfumes, never spoken of in the light of day. Over time, the build-up of stains and odours became normalised. Dresses that would horrify us today were considered perfectly wearable then, provided they appeared outwardly intact. The longer they were worn, the more invisible the filth became, blending into the fabric as though it belonged there. To wash too often was to risk damaging expensive garments. So families chose preservation over cleanliness. The unspoken rule was clear clothes were meant to last, even if they carried the residue of years. What this reveals is a culture where appearances mattered above all else. The sight of a well-dressed woman was taken as proof of refinement, even if the truth beneath was grim. The gowns themselves became symbols of denial, hiding filth in plain sight. This denial was not accidental, but systemic, a product of values that prioritized social image over physical well-being. Victorian dresses carried more than style. They carried the waste of streets and bodies alike. Women bore this weight silently, their health sacrificed for appearances. Yet even as gowns grew heavier with filth, another danger loomed in the powders and paints applied to their skin, where beauty itself became poison. White skin in the Victorian age was more than an aesthetic preference. It was a social command. A pale face was read as proof of refinement, a marker of status that separated women of the upper classes from those who laboured outdoors. To achieve this appearance, women turned to powders mixed with lead and mercury, convinced that these substances gave them the glow of nobility. Layer upon layer of toxic paste was applied to cheeks, forehead, and chin, sealing pores beneath a mask that looked smooth under candlelight but carried poison with every stroke. The pursuit of beauty became a ritual of slow self-destruction, carried out in the name of elegance. The powders themselves were harsh from the beginning. Lead carbonate, ground fine, created a powdery white surface that clung stubbornly to skin. Mercury salts added sheen, lending a faint brightness that mimicked natural radiance. But the effects of these ingredients were corrosive. Skin cracked under the weight of repeated use, sores opened at the corners of the mouth and eyes, and redness spread under the very powder meant to conceal it. It is darkly amusing that women were praised for appearing flawless, when the very substance that gave them this appearance was rotting their faces beneath. Rather than reduce their use, women applied even more powder to cover the damage. A blister became hidden under a thicker coat, an ulcer disguised with another layer. The cycle fed itself the more damage caused, the more paint applied. Physicians occasionally warned of dangers, noting cases of tremors, hair loss, or neurological symptoms. But these warnings were drowned out by fashion. Appearances mattered far more than health, and society rewarded those who looked pale, not those who looked alive. The effects spread beyond the skin. Lead seeped through pores, entering the bloodstream, causing fatigue, headaches, and even reproductive issues. Mercury damaged nerves, leaving some women with trembling hands or difficulty speaking. Yet these symptoms were rarely linked to cosmetics, instead attributed to vague notions of female fragility. A woman's illness was seen as part of her nature, not as the result of the powder sitting on her dressing table. By refusing to name the cause, society allowed the practice to continue unchecked. Cosmetic rituals also involved servants. Maids prepared the mixtures, grinding powders and applying them carefully to their mistresses' faces. This meant that they, too, inhaled fine dust with every preparation, breathing poison day after day. Their health mattered even less than that of the women they served. Exposure left many with chronic coughs or skin irritations, unrecorded and unnoticed. Compared to modern beauty products regulated for safety, the Victorian reliance on toxic powders seems almost suicidal. The powders left visible traces in daily life. White smudges stained collars, gloves, and handkerchiefs, reminders of the mask beneath. At gatherings, faint clouds of powder hung in the air as women dabbed their faces, reapplying after dancing or dining. Men who leaned in close sometimes complained of the bitter taste of powder on their lips, though never in public. The illusion was maintained at all costs, with everyone pretending not to notice the physical toll. The symbolism of pale skin extended deep into cultural ideals. A white face was not just attractive, it signified moral purity, leisure, and superiority. To darken naturally was to risk being mistaken for someone of a lower rank, or someone who worked outdoors. Women absorbed this pressure from an early age, taught that their worth was tied to their complexion. The powders became not simply tools of beauty, but weapons of social survival. I cannot help but feel uneasy when imagining women willingly covering their faces in substances they knew were painful, all to preserve a fragile illusion of status. Medical texts of the time reveal how knowledge and denial coexisted. Some physicians describe the dangers of a lead poisoning in detail, but these accounts circulated quietly, often ignored by those in power. Fashion magazines, meanwhile, continued to recommend recipes for powders, some advising mixtures of chalk, vinegar, and arsenic alongside lead and mercury. The contradiction was stark. The same society that prized women for their delicacy also demanded that they poison themselves to appear delicate. The culture of silence extended even into the family. Husbands admired their wives' pale skin, rarely questioning how it was achieved. Mothers instructed daughters in the same routines that had scarred their own faces. The damage passed quietly from one generation to another, perpetuated by the belief that suffering was the price of beauty. The few who refused the powders risked ridicule, accused of being coarse or careless. To remain natural was to be seen as unfeminine, a fate many feared more than illness itself. The consequences of this practice rippled outward. Some women died young, their organs weakened by chronic poisoning. Others lived with disfigurements, hiding scars beneath veils or heavier powders. Yet in portraits and in memory, they appeared pristine, remembered for their elegance rather than their suffering. History preserved the illusion, leaving behind paintings of pale faces without the truth of what lay beneath. In the end, the obsession with whiteness reveals the cruelty of Victorian ideals. Women were celebrated not for their vitality, but for their ability to erase it. The powders they applied became symbols of control, binding them to expectations that harmed them physically and mentally. It was a ritual of self-destruction that society called refinement, a lie maintained at the expense of countless lives. Victorian women coated their faces in lead and mercury, praised for the pallor that concealed their decay. The ritual of whitening promised beauty but delivered poison, leaving scars hidden under layers of dust. And as these powders ate away at their flesh, another silent affliction festered inside their mouths, where decaying teeth and foul breath became a constant reminder of neglect. Dental care in Victorian times was less about preserving health and more about surviving pain. With no access to professional dentistry as we know it today, teeth were neglected until they rotted away. Cavities deepened unchecked, gums swelled with infection, and breath carried the unmistakable odour of decay. The only real treatment available was extraction, often done at home with crude instruments such as pliers or iron tongs. Women were expected to endure the agony in silence, just as they endured so many other discomforts, for to complain too loudly was to risk sounding weak. The result was a culture where foul breath and missing teeth became common markers of everyday life, concealed poorly by makeshift remedies. The use of alcohol as a mouthwash was widespread. Strong spirits like gin or brandy were swirled around the mouth in an attempt to kill bacteria and dull the pain. For a moment, the sting of alcohol gave the illusion of freshness, but it did nothing to remove the infection. Instead, it left behind a sharp odour that mixed unpleasantly with the existing stench of rot. Women walked into parlours carrying the scent of liquor on their breath, an odd mixture of refinement and decay. It is bitterly amusing to imagine women praised for elegance while breathing fumes that reeked of both infection and alcohol. Other methods of concealment were equally ineffective. Some chewed dried ginger or cloves, hoping the spice would overpower the odour. The pungency of these remedies lingered only briefly before the sourness of infection returned. Perfumed handkerchiefs were sometimes held discreetly near the face during conversation, but they offered little real relief. The problem was not one of smell alone, it was the visible crumbling of teeth, blackened by rot and often missing altogether. Smiles, once praised as charming, became rare, replaced by pursed lips that hid decay from polite society. The lack of dental care was not simply neglect, but also fear. Many associated toothache with weakness of character or failure of discipline. To lose teeth was to signal moral decay as well as physical decline. Women who suffered from oral infections often endured in silence, unwilling to admit their condition. Physicians offered little help, prescribing mouth rinses of vinegar or spirits, but rarely addressing the deeper causes. Pain and shame combined to create a culture where disease was hidden behind clenched jaws and polite silence. The consequences were severe. Untreated infections spread from teeth into gums and jaws, sometimes into the bloodstream. Cases of fever and even death from dental abscesses were recorded, though rarely acknowledged as such in official notes. Families preferred to call these deaths the result of general illness rather than admit the truth of decay. Compared to modern dentistry, where routine checkups prevent most of these conditions, the Victorian acceptance of rotting mouths feels both reckless and tragic. Servants once again played their part in maintaining appearances. They were often tasked with preparing mouth rinses, pouring spirits into cups, and handing them discreetly to their mistresses. They smelled the odours up close, endured the sight of swollen gums, yet had no choice but to continue. For them, the routine was another reminder of how appearances mattered more than health. Their labour helped preserve illusions while exposing them to the same risks of contagion that plagued the households they served. I find it unsettling to imagine these women whispering through their pain, convinced that silence itself was more respectable than seeking real relief. The cultural obsession with breath revealed deeper contradictions. Women were praised for delicacy, yet their mouths carried infections that could be passed through the simplest kiss or shared cup. Social gatherings became exchanges of germs as much as courtesies. Still, people looked away, unwilling to acknowledge the reality behind the scent of perfume and the forced smiles. What mattered was the illusion of refinement, not the honesty of health. Even in death, the truth remained hidden. Skulls from the period reveal severe dental decay, abscesses, and tooth loss. But these conditions were rarely described in records of the time. Diaries might mention toothache or weakness, but not the festering infections that lay behind them. The silence of society ensured that what should have been preventable misery became a defining feature of life. This silence carried through generations, with daughters inheriting the same ignorance that had scarred their mothers. The irony is clear. A society that valued elegance forced its women to endure rotting teeth and foul breath, disguising the reality with liquor and spices. Health was sacrificed for appearances, and pain was endured to maintain silence. The cost was not only physical suffering, but also the spread of infection across families and communities. Hidden behind the polite veneer of conversation and manners, Victorian women endured mouths filled with decay, masking the smell with alcohol and spices while pain deepened in silence. Their smiles became rare, their voices edged with bitterness, yet society praised them for composure. Behind this facade, another danger lurked in the most intimate of exchanges, where kisses in candlelit ballrooms became a path for invisible contagion. Ballrooms in the Victorian era were meant to represent the height of elegance, yet beneath the glittering chandeliers and polished floors lurked invisible dangers. The act of kissing, whether in greeting or in the thrill of a dance, was treated as a display of intimacy wrapped in refinement. Women with powdered faces and men in pressed suits leaned close, believing the gesture harmless or even fashionable. But what seemed a token of charm was, in truth, a pathway for contagion. Influenza, whooping cough, and venereal diseases of the mouth spread quietly through gatherings that were supposed to uphold respectability. A single night of celebration could leave behind more than memories. It could deliver infections that altered lives permanently. Accounts from the period describe how illnesses appeared suddenly after such events. Guests who danced and kissed at parties often found themselves sick days later, yet the connection was rarely admitted. Physicians who did make the link faced resistance, since acknowledging it would tarnish the reputation of the gatherings themselves. Instead, symptoms were blamed on drafts, weak constitutions, or the general malaise of city air. This refusal to speak openly allowed infections to thrive, passed from one set of lips to another under the cover of music and candlelight. It is almost absurd that a society obsessed with etiquette encouraged greetings that carried disease more effectively than any handshake. One particularly chilling report described 3 women who developed severe gum infections after kissing the same gentleman at a winter ball. Within weeks, their mouths showed necrosis, tissue breaking down in ways too gruesome for polite society to describe. Rather than condemn the gentleman, whispers circulated about the women's supposed weaknesses, as though their suffering was a reflection of moral failure. In this way, disease became entangled with judgment, silencing the victims while protecting the reputation of men. The cruelty of this arrangement left women not only ill, but also shamed for conditions they did not cause. The cultural framing of such infections was steeped in contradiction. While women were told to embody purity, they were also expected to participate in rituals that exposed them to contamination. The kiss was treated as fashionable, even necessary, yet the consequences were ignored. Men carried illnesses from brothels or taverns into ballrooms, spreading them without consequence. Women who fell ill faced suspicion, while men returned to their social circles untouched by blame. Compared to today, where awareness of germs informs even casual interactions, the Victorian blindness to contagion seems reckless to the point of cruelty. The idea that sores on the lips could become fashionable only deepens the strangeness. Records hint at how inflamed patches were sometimes described as peculiar beauty marks, noticed and even remarked upon in hushed tones. What should have been recognised as a disease was reframed as novelty, another way society disguised its own negligence. This reinterpretation allowed the cycle to continue, ensuring that symptoms never disrupted the illusion of glamour that ballrooms were meant to project. Servants who worked at these events observed the aftermath firsthand. They cleared discarded handkerchiefs stained with blood or saliva, swept away cups from which dozens had drunk, and inhaled the mingled odours of perfume and infection. Yet their voices, as always, were absent from the record. They saw the cost of these gatherings most clearly, but their perspective carried no weight. Their silence mirrored the silence of the women who suffered, bound by a culture that prized appearances above truth. I cannot help but feel unsettled at the thought of disease moving invisibly from mouth to mouth, while music and laughter drowned out every warning. The ballroom itself, with its crowded air and shared glasses of punch, was the perfect incubator. Poor ventilation and tight quarters amplified the risk, turning each evening into a potential outbreak. Yet society continued the rituals because to stop them would mean questioning the very structures of elegance and class. The contradiction was stark. Gatherings meant to symbolize refinement became hotbeds of illness, while those who suffered were left invisible. Illnesses acquired in this way rarely stayed confined to the ballroom. Women carried them home, where they spread to husbands, children, and servants. The domestic sphere, supposedly a place of safety, became infected through these public displays. The cycle of denial continued, with families inventing excuses for sudden sickness rather than confronting the truth. The pattern repeated itself year after year, leaving behind scars both physical and social. In death records, the cause was rarely stated plainly. Notes listed exhaustion or decline, never naming the infections that ravaged mouths and lungs. Society's silence protected reputations but erased the suffering of women who endured these conditions. Their pain became part of the unspoken history of the time, hidden beneath the language of propriety. The absence of honesty allowed the same tragedies to repeat endlessly, each one disguised as something else. The reality of kissing in Victorian ballrooms was not romance but risk. Behind each gentle touch lingered the possibility of infection, yet the culture demanded silence. The rituals continued, upheld by illusion, even as they carved away at the health of those forced to participate. In this way, the ballroom became both stage and trap, a place where disease wore the mask of elegance. Victorian gatherings celebrated intimacy with kisses that carried sickness as easily as affection. Women paid the highest price, their suffering hidden while reputation stayed intact, And as these rituals spread contagion from one household to another, even the simplest object, a towel in the corner of a room, became another unsuspected accomplice in the circulation of disease. Towels in Victorian households were not the personal, hygienic items we take for granted today. They were scarce objects, shared among family members, guests, and servants alike. A few clothes hung near basins or on windowsills, damp and often stained, waiting for whoever needed them next. These towels were rarely washed thoroughly, sometimes only shaken out or aired in the sun to remove visible dirt. What passed for cleanliness was, in reality, a cycle of constant reuse that spread filth from one person to another without anyone daring to acknowledge it. Guests in these homes were offered the same towels already used by servants who had wiped their hands, faces, or even feet. To question the practice would have been impolite, so most complied, rubbing their skin against cloth already damp with another's residue. The fibres carried remnants of sweat, oils, and sometimes blood, pressed directly onto new users without thought. In this way, a simple act of drying one's hands became a silent transfer of germs. It is almost comical to imagine refined visitors sipping tea gracefully after wiping their mouths on the same towel a servant had used on her muddy shoes. The spread of disease through these clothes was predictable. Cold sores, fungal infections, and rashes appeared in clusters after gatherings, though no one wished to admit the connection. Medical texts occasionally mentioned cases of skin irritation linked to shared linens, yet the warnings carried little weight. Families believed that if towels were left in sunlight or dusted with powder, they were restored to safety. This illusion allowed them to continue the practice, convincing themselves that etiquette was preserved even as hygiene collapsed. Perfume played its usual role in disguising reality. Towels were sometimes sprinkled with lavender water to give them a pleasant scent, masking the underlying dampness. Yet fragrance could not erase the risk, and users pressed these perfumed rags against their faces without hesitation. The same cloth might move from a servant's rough hands to the delicate lips of her mistress within an hour. Respectability relied on appearances, not on unseen cleanliness, so the cycle endured without question. The scarcity of towels stemmed from both cost and effort. Linen and cotton were expensive, and washing them required long hours of labour. Servants soaked, scrubbed, and wrung out each piece by hand, often in cold water that failed to remove deep stains. To save themselves work, families limited the number of towels in circulation, expecting them to serve multiple purposes. A single cloth might dry hands in the morning, clean spills at midday, and serve guests in the evening. The idea of single-use hygiene was foreign, replaced by thrift and denial. Compared to modern households where every person expects a clean towel, the Victorian acceptance of communal cloths feels dangerously careless. Servants endured the greatest burden of this custom. They handled towels heavy with moisture and odour, spreading them out to dry in corners of kitchens or halls. Their own health was at risk, yet they had no power to insist on better practices. Skin infections among maids were treated as unfortunate but unremarkable, ignored by the families they served. The very tools meant to signal refinement in households were, for the staff, symbols of neglect and exposure. I find myself disturbed by the image of these women forced to clean and reuse the same cloths, knowing their efforts only spread the problem further. The social consequences of questioning these habits ensured silence. A guest who refused a towel risked appearing rude or ungrateful. Families prided themselves on hospitality, offering shared linens as though they were tokens of care. To reject them was to reject the household itself. Thus, even those who suspected the risks complied, placing propriety above personal safety. The result was a system where appearance once again triumphed over health. Infections spread quickly in this environment. Reports from the time describe outbreaks of skin lesions after tea gatherings, with multiple guests falling ill. These were rarely acknowledged as epidemics, instead described as unfortunate coincidences. The unwillingness to connect disease to domestic habits left families vulnerable again and again. By keeping the truth unspoken, they ensured its repetition. Children faced a particular risk. Young hands and faces wiped on the same towels carried germs back to nurseries, infecting siblings and caregivers. The cycle of sharing continued endlessly, with no thought given to breaking it. What could have been solved with more clothes and better laundering remained unchecked because of expense, labour, and cultural silence. The smallest infections sometimes worsened into dangerous fevers, yet the link to towels remained buried under layers of denial. Even in wealthier homes, where more resources were available, the same habits persisted. Gilded mirrors and polished basins gave the illusion of refinement, but the towels nearby told a different story. They were often discoloured, their edges fraying, and their fibres stiff from repeated drying. Guests wiped their faces and hands regardless, smiling politely as though nothing were wrong. These households prided themselves on elegance, yet their practices revealed a darker, unspoken truth. The contradictions were glaring. A society that valued delicacy and manners tolerated coarse neglect in hygiene. The very homes praised for refinement spread disease through objects meant to signal care. In this way, Victorian households maintained their image while endangering the health of everyone within them. It was a balance sustained not by ignorance alone, but by the deliberate refusal to speak openly about what everyone already suspected. Over time, this habit became so normal that its dangers faded from memory. Towels stiff with old stains hung in homes for years, carried forward as though they were respectable furnishings. The silence surrounding them preserved the illusion of propriety, even as infections spread unchecked. By the time better hygiene practices emerged, the damage had already been woven into the fabric of Victorian daily life. Victorian homes offered guests and family members the same damp, perfumed towels, spreading disease with every polite gesture. The custom turned symbols of hospitality into carriers of infection, tolerated for the sake of appearance. Yet if towels could spread sickness so quietly, the vessels used for human waste were far worse, filling homes with risks that no perfume could disguise. Toilets in Victorian households were not the flushable conveniences we know today, but crude arrangements that brought waste into the very spaces where families ate, slept, and entertained. Instead of running water, most homes relied on what was known as the night soil system. Buckets or iron pails were placed under wooden seats, collecting urine and feces throughout the day and night. These containers sat in bedrooms, closets, or small annexes, their contents accumulating until a servant carried them away in the morning. What appeared to be order and refinement on the surface of Victorian life was underpinned by a system that placed human waste at its very centre. The design of these makeshift toilets left little protection from odour. Even with lids or coverings, the smell seeped through, filling rooms with an unmistakable stench. Flowers might be placed nearby to disguise it, but the effect was fleeting. The mixture of urine and feces, fermenting overnight, produced an atmosphere that clung to fabrics, carpets, and curtains. Guests invited into parlours with fresh bouquets may not have realised that only a wall away, or sometimes in the very same room, sat the pail of waste that household members had used hours before. It is almost ridiculous to think that people dined on fine china, while the stench of human waste hovered only steps away. Servants bore the responsibility of emptying these pails each morning, carrying them down narrow staircases or across courtyards to be dumped into larger pits or carts. The task was hazardous and humiliating, exposing them to splashes, spills, and the judgment of others if an accident occurred. Buckets often overflowed before they could be emptied, leaving trails on stairs and floors. In some homes, the waste was simply thrown into gutters or gardens, where it lingered until rain washed it further into the streets. The cycle made disease an unavoidable part of daily life, even in homes that prided themselves on refinement. For women, this system created particular difficulties. The heavy skirts they wore made using chamber pots awkward, leading to accidents that soiled clothing. Urine or menstrual blood often stains fabric, which is then dragged across floors already contaminated by waste. The humiliation of these moments was rarely spoken of, yet they were common. Instead of addressing the problem, women relied on perfume or powders to mask the evidence, continuing the Victorian tradition of denial over honesty. Compared to today's sanitation systems, where waste is removed instantly and unseen, the Victorian household practice seems closer to medieval squalor than modern refinement. The smell of night soil lingered everywhere. Bedrooms, even richly decorated ones, carried the faint odour of ammonia that no perfume could erase. Dining rooms were not immune, especially in townhouses where waste had to be carried through hallways used for meals and social gatherings. Guests may have noticed but remained silent, preserving etiquette even as they breathed air heavy with contamination. The silence itself became part of the ritual, proof of a culture that valued appearances more than health. Medical consequences were inevitable. Waste exposed to the open air attracted flies, which then carried bacteria onto food and into kitchens. Diseases such as cholera and dysentery spread easily in these conditions, yet their origins were often misunderstood. People blamed bad air or personal weakness rather than the buckets sitting in their own homes. This refusal to confront reality allowed epidemics to take hold again and again, devastating neighbourhoods while households clung to their illusions of respectability. Children were especially vulnerable. Toddlers crawled on floors where waste had dripped or spilled, their hands touching contaminated surfaces before reaching their mouths. Infants rocked in cradles beside chamber pots breathed in the same fumes as adults. Outbreaks of diarrhea and fever among the young were tragically common, but families rarely questioned the role of their own practices. To speak openly of sanitation was considered improper, so the suffering continued in silence. I cannot help but feel uneasy at the thought of infants breathing air thick with the fumes of their family's waste, their lives shaped by the neglect of a culture unwilling to change. Servants again paid the highest price. They were expected to handle multiple households' worth of waste if employed in larger estates, hauling pails daily and often at night when emergencies arose. Exposure to filth was constant, yet their complaints were dismissed. Illness among servants was seen as proof of their low status rather than the predictable outcome of dangerous work. In this way, the very system of night soil reinforced class divisions, with health sacrificed at the bottom to maintain comfort at the top. The disposal of waste into public spaces spreads problems beyond individual homes. Streets ran with sewage, particularly in poorer districts where municipal collection was inconsistent. The infamous Great Stink of London in 1858 demonstrated how pervasive the problem had become, with the Thames itself reeking so strongly that the government could no longer ignore it. Yet long before such crises, individual households were already steeped in the dangers of their own private arrangements, pretending refinement while living in filth. Even death records from the time bear traces of this denial. Many listed causes, such as fever, decline, or exhaustion, phrases that obscured the role of contaminated living conditions. Families preferred vague explanations to admitting that the disease had come from their own waste practices. This silence perpetuated the system, ensuring that change came only with large-scale public health reforms rather than individual awareness. The contradiction was striking. Homes filled with polished furniture, lace curtains, and fine china coexisted with the constant presence of open waste. Refinement and filth lived side by side, bound together by silence and denial. This was not merely a private discomfort but a public hazard, one that shaped the health of entire cities, while households continued to cling to illusions of propriety. Victorian toilets did not remove waste. They preserved it within the walls of the home, carried out only when servants risked their own health to empty it. Families dined and entertained in an air touched by human filth, pretending not to notice. And if waste itself could be carried so casually through drawing rooms, It is no surprise that the same unwashed hands that touched buckets and basins moved next to the food table, ready to spread disease in ways even more direct. Hand-washing in Victorian society was a practice that bore little resemblance to what we consider necessary today. There was no widespread concept of soap designed to eliminate germs, nor was there an understanding of how disease could be transferred from one person to another by touch. At best, people rinsed their hands in cold water or splashed them with diluted spirits, believing the gesture sufficient to refresh the skin. In reality, the act removed little more than surface dust. The same hands that had just emptied chamber pots, adjusted clothing, or touched contaminated fabrics moved effortlessly toward plates of food. What was presented as civility at the dining table was, in truth, a silent system of infection. Women's routines brought their hands into constant contact with objects that carried filth. Dresses trailed through streets thick with horse manure, then were adjusted and smoothed with bare fingers. Hats and gloves, worn daily, absorbed dust and sweat, then were touched repeatedly as women rearranged them. Hair was brushed and powdered, leaving residue on hands that were never thoroughly cleaned. These hands then reached for pastries, fruit, or slices of meat at social gatherings. It is almost laughable to imagine people congratulating themselves on refinement while passing germs from dress hems to dining tables without hesitation. Meals themselves offered endless opportunities for contamination. In many homes, food was served communally, with guests using their hands to pick at bread or meat. Knives and forks were not always distributed evenly, particularly in informal gatherings. What mattered most was the appearance of generosity, not the prevention of disease. Hands touched shared platters repeatedly, carrying with them the residues of chamber pots, pets, and household chores. Guests smiled politely, unaware that each bite they took carried with it an invisible risk. The absence of proper hygiene created fertile ground for gastrointestinal illnesses. Diarrhea, dysentery, and cholera spread rapidly, particularly in urban households where waste disposal was already inadequate. Yet the connection between hand-washing and disease was rarely made. Doctors wrote of weak constitutions or seasonal fevers rather than pointing to the obvious cause. Families preferred to maintain silence, for to admit that dirty hands caused illness would mean admitting that their own customs were to blame. Compared to modern norms, where hand-washing before meals is taught from childhood, the Victorian acceptance of dirty fingers at the table feels shockingly negligent. Servants once again played a central role in sustaining these practices. They prepared food after emptying chamber pots, often with no opportunity to wash properly in between. Cold water splashed hastily over their hands did nothing to remove contamination, but meals were still served with confidence. Employers rarely questioned how food was handled, trusting appearances over reality. When illness struck, it was easier to blame outside causes, bad air, spoiled ingredients than to acknowledge that their own servants had no chance to practice real hygiene. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine banquets prepared by hands that had just carried waste through the same halls where guests would dine. Public events amplified the problem. Tea gatherings, luncheons, and balls brought together dozens of guests who touched the same cups, spoons, and platters. Servants refilled cups without washing their hands. Guests sampled food directly from trays, and all of it was done in the name of hospitality. Outbreaks often followed, with clusters of guests falling ill days later. Yet polite society avoided mentioning the link. Illness was treated as an unfortunate coincidence, never as the inevitable result of unhygienic customs. The neglect of hand-washing extended even into medical settings. Doctors examined patients without cleaning their hands between visits, moving from the sick to the healthy with ease. Midwives and nurses, often untrained in sanitation, handled childbirth and illness alike with fingers unwashed since morning. The consequences were severe, with infections spreading in hospitals and homes at rates that horrify us today. Still, society clung to silence, unwilling to connect personal habits to public health. The contradiction could not have been clearer. A culture that valued manners and etiquette ignored the most basic forms of hygiene. Clean gloves or polished silverware were seen as marks of refinement, but the hands that touched them carried filth. Appearances triumphed over reality, leaving health as the silent casualty. This dissonance was not hidden by accident. It was protected deliberately, sustained by denial and the fear of scandal. Children, too, grew up in this environment, learning to eat with unwashed hands because no one taught them otherwise. Their small bodies suffered most, vulnerable to infections that adults might survive. Fevers swept through nurseries, claiming young lives with tragic regularity. Yet even these losses were explained away as fate, never as the result of cultural negligence. The silence of parents, doctors, and society ensured that change would not come quickly. Over time, the cost of this neglect accumulated. Households recorded illness after illness, yet the same routines continued. Washing hands with soap was considered unnecessary or even suspicious, as though those who practiced it were overly fussy. The very act of suggesting more careful hygiene risked social ridicule. In this way, customs that endangered health were preserved as symbols of tradition. Victorian households treated rinsing with water or spirits as enough, sending unwashed hands from chamber pots to dining tables with ease. Illness spread silently, disguised as weakness or chance, while appearances remained intact. Yet if the simple act of eating together could become a source of infection, the gatherings most celebrated for their civility, the afternoon teas, held dangers that reached even further than the dining room. Afternoon tea was one of the most prized rituals of Victorian social life. It carried an aura of elegance, with porcelain cups, polished silver spoons, and carefully arranged cakes. Guests admired the delicate manners of their hostesses, believing themselves to be in an atmosphere of refinement. Yet beneath this polished scene hid a reality that was far less graceful. The very hands that served the tea, hands considered symbols of gentility, were often the instruments of contagion. Long nails coated in powder and perfume concealed dirt and bacteria, turning what should have been a symbol of hospitality into a weapon of disease. Victorian women were encouraged to keep their nails long and pale, signs of refinement that separated them from manual labourers. To maintain the appearance, they rubbed powders onto their skin and used gloves to protect the whiteness of their hands. But the space beneath their nails remained untouched. Without proper tools or habits of cleaning, black grime collected easily, a mixture of soil, food remnants, and even traces of bodily waste. These same hands arranged cakes, poured tea, and passed delicate biscuits to guests. It is almost darkly humorous to imagine a table praised for elegance, while every gesture of the hostess delivered hidden bacteria into her guests' food. The illusion of refinement made the problem worse. The smooth whiteness of powdered skin suggested purity, masking the filth beneath. Women dabbed their hands with scented water or sprinkled powders on them before events, convinced this was sufficient. The rituals disguised smell and appearance but ignored the unseen. The result was that gatherings celebrated as the pinnacle of civility became environments where disease moved easily from person to person, carried invisibly beneath manicured fingertips. One notorious case became the subject of whispered scandal. A well-known hostess was accused after 12 of her guests fell ill and died following an afternoon tea. Investigation suggested cholera spread through food handled directly by her hands. The shock was not only in the deaths, but in the fact that such a refined woman could be linked to filth. Families tried to suppress the story, but it lingered in gossip and in the warnings of physicians. Instead of leading to reform, however, it was treated as an isolated tragedy. Most continued with the same habits, unwilling to confront the truth about their social rituals. The risk of infection was not limited to cholera. Typhoid, dysentery, and various skin infections found their way into households through these gatherings. Cups and spoons were shared. Plates passed from one person to another, each touched by hands that had recently adjusted skirts, handled chamber pots, or brushed through powdered hair. Guests smiled politely, praising the spread, while invisible dangers spread with every bite, compared to today, when hand hygiene is emphasized before any shared meal. The Victorian acceptance of long, dirty nails at the tea table seems reckless to the point of absurdity. Servants contributed to this cycle not by choice but by obligation. They prepared sandwiches and pastries, pouring tea while managing other tasks around the household. Their hands, often raw from scrubbing floors or handling coal, were given no chance for proper cleaning before handling food. Employers did not question this, assuming their presence in uniform was enough to ensure order. In reality, the very labour that kept homes functioning brought contaminants into the meals celebrated as refined. I find myself unsettled imagining trays of cakes passed from servant to mistress to guest, each layer of contamination hidden beneath a veil of powdered hands and polite conversation. The design of the tea ritual itself made outbreaks easier. Small cakes and biscuits were meant to be eaten with fingers, not utensils. Shared sugar bowls and cream pitchers required touching the same spoons. Every movement of the hand spreads germs further, creating a network of contact that links every guest at the table. A single infected hand could contaminate dozens of objects within minutes, ensuring wide transmission. Yet no one spoke of this openly, for to question tea was to question one of the foundations of Victorian social order. The silence surrounding hygiene was reinforced by etiquette. Guests were trained to avoid noticing unpleasant realities. Even if someone suspected the cause of illness, they would never raise it publicly. To do so would risk social ruin, branding the speaker as impolite. In this way, silence became complicit in spreading disease, as dangerous as the filth itself. The veneer of manners preserved the ritual, even at the cost of lives. Medical accounts from the time occasionally hinted at the risks. Doctors described outbreaks after social gatherings, but rarely confronted the cultural practices directly. They wrote in vague terms about general contagion or domestic sources rather than naming the tea table. By avoiding specifics, they protected the reputation of respectable families, even as the same conditions repeated again and again. This reluctance to speak plainly delayed meaningful change, leaving women and their guests to endure unnecessary suffering. The contradiction was glaring. Afternoon tea symbolized cleanliness, civility, and grace, yet it became one of the easiest avenues for disease to spread. The very hands praised for their whiteness carried death beneath their nails, and the very ritual meant to strengthen social bonds spread misery instead. The illusion of refinement, once again, was upheld at the expense of truth. Over time, such habits hardened into unquestioned tradition. Powdered hands, long nails, and shared cloths remained features of tea gatherings, celebrated in magazines and diaries. The deaths they caused faded into silence, buried under layers of etiquette and denial. The ritual of tea survived not because it was safe, but because it was too central to Victorian identity to be challenged. Victorian tea tables were polished and perfumed, yet the food they offered often carried disease from the very hands that served it. Guests risked illness and death with every polite sip, but society chose silence over reform. And while germs spread at the table, the dangers were no less present in the most private of spaces, where garments worn to these same gatherings carried months of filth from unwashed beds and bodies. Bedrooms in the Victorian age were rarely warm refugees from the cold. Without central heating, the temperature indoors often matched that of the streets outside. Stone walls and wooden floors trapped dampness rather than offering protection, and fireplaces, if they existed at all, barely warmed the air beyond a small radius. At night, as families lay down in heavy beds, their breath condensed in the frigid atmosphere. Each exhalation turned to droplets that clung to fabric, seeping slowly into collars, sleeves, and bedding. By morning, the garments meant to provide comfort were damp with moisture, creating a breeding ground for discomfort and disease. Night clothes, usually made of thick wool or coarse linen, absorbed this condensation easily. The fibres held onto water throughout the night, growing heavier against the body. Women woke to find collars soaked and sleeves clammy, the dampness pressing against their chests and throats. Instead of warmth, their garments carried chill deep into the skin. To change clothes was impractical, so they wore the same wet garments again and again, allowing mildew and fungi to take hold. It is almost grimly amusing that a society so concerned with elegance in daylight ignored the fact that its women slept each night wrapped in damp, fungus-friendly cloth. The damp environment also weakened resistance to illness. Women already burdened by heavy clothing and a poor diet were more vulnerable to respiratory infections. Coughs and fevers lingered through winter, worsened by the constant presence of moisture around the chest and neck. The link between wet fabric and sickness was rarely acknowledged. Instead, women were advised to drink tonics or stay in bed, which only prolonged exposure. What might have been prevented by warmth and dryness became another silent source of suffering in households that valued appearances more than health. Laundry offered little relief. Washing night clothes was laborious and costly, especially in winter when drying took days. Families hesitated to launder these garments often, choosing instead to air them by the fire or leave them hanging in cold rooms. The smell of damp wool mixed with body odours fills sleeping spaces with a musty heaviness. Once again, perfume or sachets of dried herbs were used to disguise the problem, though they did nothing to remove the underlying causes. Compared to modern nights with heated homes and freshly laundered pyjamas, the Victorian habit of sleeping in damp clothes seems uncomfortably close to voluntary misery. Servants, as always, suffered doubly. They worked in colder quarters, often with no fireplaces at all, and wore nightclothes that were thinner and less insulating. Their garments, too, absorbed the condensation of their breath, leaving them vulnerable to the same infections as their mistresses. Yet their illnesses were dismissed as proof of poor breeding or weak constitutions, not as the direct result of unhealthy living conditions. I find it disturbing to imagine entire households breathing moisture into their clothes night after night, slowly poisoning themselves with dampness disguised as routine. The effect extended beyond physical illness. Damp garments left women uncomfortable, disrupting their rest and leaving them fatigued during the day. Fatigue was interpreted as fragility, reinforcing stereotypes of female weakness. Instead of questioning the conditions that produced it, society embraced the image of women as delicate, requiring protection and rest. Thus, the culture of damp night clothes not only harmed women's health, but also reinforced the very roles that limited their independence. Medical observations from the period sometimes hinted at the dangers. Doctors noted cases of skin rashes and fungal infections spreading across the chest and neck, especially in colder months. They prescribed ointments or recommended thicker clothing, but rarely addressed the root cause. The connection between breath, condensation, and damp garments was either ignored or minimized. In this silence, infections worsened, leaving women with persistent irritation and discomfort that became normalized over time. The architecture of Victorian houses amplified the problem. High ceilings and poorly insulated windows created drafts that carried cold air across beds. Even with layers of blankets, the body could not escape the chill of a room steeped in dampness. Curtains froze to window panes in winter, trapping frost inside as well as out. Families prided themselves on the grandeur of their homes, yet those same designs left them vulnerable to nightly encounters with cold and wet fabric. Children shared the same risks. Small bodies curled under damp sheets, breathing shallowly in frigid rooms, often awoke coughing. Illness spread quickly in nurseries where several siblings slept together, their combined breath adding to the condensation that soaked linens. Parents described these fevers as common childhood ailments, rarely connecting them to the nightly conditions. The cycle of illness and neglect repeated itself across generations, protected by silence and denial. Even in wealthier homes, where resources were greater, the problem persisted. Elaborate nightgowns and fine sheets may have been softer, but they absorbed moisture just as readily. The difference was only in appearance. Dampness clung equally to silk or linen, leaving women at risk regardless of class. The illusion of refinement once again masked the reality of discomfort, sustaining traditions that harmed rather than protected. The contradiction is clear. Victorian society celebrated elegance, yet its members endured nights in cold, wet garments that weakened their health. They sought purity and refinement, yet ignored the practical needs of their bodies. In choosing to disguise rather than resolve the problem, they preserved traditions that guaranteed suffering. The silence around this practice reflects the larger pattern of denial that shaped so much of Victorian life. Over time, the nightly dampness became normalised, no longer noticed by those who endured it. The musty smell, the clammy fabric, the morning coughs, these were accepted as ordinary parts of life. Only with the advent of modern heating and sanitation did the true scale of this discomfort come into focus. The Victorian bedroom, once admired for its heavy curtains and ornate beds, was in fact a chamber of cold dampness, breeding illness with every breath. Victorian women slept each night in garments soaked by their own breath, garments that carried cold and infection against their skin. Their suffering was hidden behind silence and routine, tolerated as though it were natural. Yet the very powders and perfumes they used to mask these conditions introduced another layer of danger, spreading toxic substances across already weakened bodies. Powders were a daily companion for Victorian women, pressed and sprinkled onto the body as though they were marks of refinement. They came in small boxes lined with paper, or in decorative jars placed on dressing tables, always within reach. The idea was simple: cover the smell of sweat, mask the dampness of clothing, and create the illusion of cleanliness without water. Women dusted themselves multiple times a day, focusing especially on areas that trapped heat and odour. It was a ritual that seemed elegant on the surface, but the powders themselves carried substances that harmed the very bodies they were meant to protect. The formulas varied, but many included borax, alum, or even finely ground lead. These ingredients absorbed moisture effectively, which made them popular, but they were also corrosive and toxic. Applied directly to delicate skin, they caused irritation, cracking, and sometimes open sores. Women who noticed redness or pain were often told it was their natural constitution, a weakness of the flesh, rather than the result of what they had applied. It is almost absurd to imagine someone sprinkling poison onto their own skin several times a day, believing it to be a form of self-care. The use of powder was tied closely to the cultural obsession with modesty. Water was mistrusted as weakening, and bathing was rare. So powders filled the gap. Women dusted their underarms, groins, and chests, ensuring that even when clothing absorbed sweat, the smell was disguised. It was not only personal comfort but social survival, as being suspected of smelling unclean was a threat to reputation. Perfumed powders became both shield and prison, reinforcing the silence around hygiene by offering a cosmetic solution that avoided real cleanliness. Servants handled much of this process, shaking powder onto their mistresses or preparing jars in the morning. Their own hands and lungs absorbed the residue, inhaling lead or alum dust daily. They suffered coughs and throat irritation, symptoms that were never linked to their duties. Mistresses, too, carried the burden, though theirs was framed as refinement rather than exposure. The dangers of these powders were invisible, lingering in the skin and bloodstream long after their scent had faded. Compared to today's routines of deodorants and body washes, the Victorian reliance on toxic dust feels not only primitive but alarmingly reckless. Doctors of the period occasionally warned of the risks. Medical reports described cases of skin ulcers or poisoning linked to cosmetics, but the warnings rarely changed behaviour. Women were told their sores came from weak bodies, not from the jars on their tables. Society's fixation on purity outweighed the voices of caution. To abandon powder was to risk suspicion of uncleanliness, a label far more frightening to Victorian women than the slow burn of illness. I cannot help but feel disturbed by the thought of women applying these powders with care, convinced they were guarding their dignity while unknowingly undermining their health. Powders also accumulated in clothing. Dresses and undergarments became coated with residue, forming gritty layers that irritated skin further. The friction of corsets and heavy fabrics pressed the powder deep into pores, worsening inflammation. When clothing was finally washed, the water turned cloudy with the chemicals it released, another silent reminder of how much had been absorbed. The cycle continued without interruption, each application layering more danger onto already weakened bodies. In wealthier homes, powders were more heavily perfumed, mixing lavender or rose with borax and lead. The fragrance was pleasant, convincing users that beauty and health had been achieved together. In poorer households, simple alum or chalk powders were used, harsher on the skin but still believed to serve the same purpose. Across classes, the practice was united by the same illusion that masking odour was enough to preserve respectability. The broader consequences stretched beyond individuals. Powder dust lingered in rooms, settling on furniture and linens. Families breathed it in as they moved through their homes, unaware of the toxins clinging to the air. Babies rocked in cradles beside dressing tables inhaled the same particles as their mothers. Illness spread quietly, framed as weakness or fate rather than the predictable result of daily exposure. This reliance on powders reflected the larger Victorian pattern of silence and denial. Instead of confronting the causes of odour or illness, society built rituals that concealed them. A woman who powdered herself was praised for refinement, even as sores grew beneath her corset. The contradiction between appearance and reality defined much of Victorian life, but in the case of powders, it left scars both visible and invisible. Over time, the practice became so normal that its dangers faded into the background. Women handed jars of powder to their daughters, passing down routines without questioning their safety. The legacy of this custom endured, a silent inheritance of suffering disguised as elegance. Only with the rise of modern chemistry and medicine did the true risks come into view, but for many, it was far too late. Victorian women dusted themselves daily with powders laced with poison, believing they were protecting their dignity. The sores, coughs, and weakness that followed were dismissed as natural frailty, ensuring the ritual continued unchallenged. Yet if garments and skin were already carrying toxic residues, the larger garments kept for ceremonies, stored for years without washing, concealed dangers that could prove even more deadly. Ceremonial dresses in Victorian society carried symbolic weight that far outweighed practical considerations of hygiene. Wedding gowns, baptismal dresses, and garments worn for special rituals were considered sacred, infused with meaning beyond their material form. For this reason, many women refused to wash them after the first use. To cleanse the fabric was believed to wash away memory, luck, or spiritual significance. Instead, these garments were folded carefully, stains and all, then wrapped in paper or cloth before being placed in trunks or cupboards. Over time, what began as cherished mementos turned into repositories of filth, sealed away in silence. The stains left on these garments were rarely trivial. Blood from menstruation, sweat from hours of wear under heavy layers, and bodily secretions absorbed by fabric remained trapped in the fibres. The dresses, often made of thick silk or layered with lace, held onto moisture and dirt with ease. When packed away, these elements fermented in the dark, feeding colonies of mould and bacteria. To the women who stored them, the garments represented purity and devotion, yet hidden within was a slow process of decay that undermined the very ideals they symbolized. It is almost grotesque to think of a gown admired for its holiness while rotting quietly with traces of the body still embedded in its fabric. the cultural reverence for these garments discouraged questioning. A woman who preserved her dress intact was praised for honouring tradition. Families passed these dresses down, considering them heirlooms. Opening a trunk decades later, however, could release a stench that betrayed the truth. Accounts describe blackened lace, crumbling silk, and stains that had hardened into stiff patches of fabric. Yet instead of admitting that such practices were dangerous, families often rewrapped the garments and returned them to storage, unwilling to taint their legacy with reality. The risk to health was undeniable. Mold spores spread easily from these garments into the surrounding air, contaminating cupboards and rooms. Servants tasked with cleaning or rearranging storage were the first to suffer, inhaling particles that triggered coughing, fever, or worse. Some fell ill after handling these sacred dresses, their conditions dismissed as bad luck or frailty. Compared to modern standards, where even the most delicate clothing is preserved through careful cleaning, the Victorian choice to store filth as memory seems both careless and disturbingly unsanitary. Stories of tragedy circulated quietly, though rarely in official records. In one case, a family opened a preserved wedding gown decades after it had been worn, releasing fumes so noxious that servants fainted. Others described sudden illnesses among those who handled heirloom dresses. Doctors sometimes noted unexplained respiratory issues, particularly among domestic staff, without tracing them back to these stored garments. Silence and superstition ensured the dangers remained hidden. I find it unsettling to imagine daughters inheriting dresses heavy not with blessings but with mould and disease, yet treasuring them all the same because tradition demanded it. The class divide shaped these habits as well. Wealthier families could afford elaborate gowns, which were then stored for decades as symbols of their prestige. Poorer women, when they owned ceremonial garments at all, often faced the same dilemma: wash and risk destroying the fabric, or preserve and risk their health. Many chose the latter, valuing the dress as an emblem of status, even if it carried the same stains that made it dangerous. Over time, the garments became not just family heirlooms, but artifacts of denial. They embodied the contradiction at the heart of Victorian life, the pursuit of purity through practices that guaranteed contamination. Guests admired the gowns when they were displayed or mentioned, unaware of the filth woven deep into their folds. The secrecy surrounding these garments was part of a larger silence, a refusal to confront the costs of maintaining appearances. The architecture of Victorian homes amplified the problem. Dresses stored in wooden trunks or damp closets absorbed the moisture of poorly ventilated rooms. Mildew spread from one garment to another, infecting blankets, linens, and even the wood itself. What began as a single stained dress could, over the years, contaminate entire storage spaces. Families noticed the smell but often dismissed it as the natural odour of age, unwilling to disturb the illusion of preservation. Magazines and etiquette guides of the time reinforced this culture of silence. They advised women on how to fold and wrap dresses, but rarely mentioned washing them. The message was clear: honour tradition, not cleanliness. Women followed these instructions faithfully, even when evidence of decay was plain to see. In this way, social pressure ensured that harmful practices survived, cloaked in the language of respectability. By the late Victorian era, advances in medicine and chemistry began to challenge these customs. Some reformers argued for better care of clothing, warning against the dangers of mould and filth. Yet these voices remained faint against the weight of tradition. Families continued to cling to their heirlooms, preferring to preserve illusion rather than embrace uncomfortable truths. The contradiction is striking. Dresses that symbolise sacred beginnings became silent carriers of decay, spreading danger into the very households that revered them. Purity was celebrated, yet filth was preserved. Refinement was praised, yet negligence was practised. This was Victorian society in miniature appearances guarded at all costs, even when they concealed rot. Ceremonial dresses in Victorian homes were preserved not as garments, but as monuments, sealed with stains and silence. They stood as proof of purity while harbouring mould, disease, and the memory of unwashed bodies. And if fabric itself could become a hazard when hidden away, the act of uncovering these garments years later revealed dangers far more immediate, sometimes ending in tragedy that no perfume or tradition could disguise. The story of an unwashed wedding dress turning deadly may sound like a legend, but in the Victorian world, it was entirely possible. Dresses worn once and sealed away carried not only memories, but also the stains and secretions of the body, blood from menstruation, sweat from tightly laced hours, and other fluids soaked into the fabric, then fermented slowly in trunks where air rarely moved. Over the decades, these fibres became breeding grounds for bacteria, mould, and chemical reactions between the fabric and bodily residue. When finally disturbed, the air that escaped was heavy with toxins. What had once been a treasured symbol of purity became a silent hazard, waiting to be unleashed. Accounts tell of servants assigned to clean or prepare these garments for later anniversaries. In one case, a wedding dress sealed for years in a damp wooden chest was opened, so it could be aired for a celebration. The maids who lifted it found themselves overwhelmed by the stench. Within minutes, dizziness set in. They collapsed from inhaling the fumes, and soon their lungs were compromised by infections that doctors could not name. All 3 women died within days. Families concealed the cause, not wishing their treasured heirloom to become a scandal. It is almost morbidly ironic that a dress meant to celebrate love and beginnings ended as a shroud of death for the very people forced to care for it. The silence surrounding such cases was deliberate. Households depended on servants to maintain appearances, and to admit that heirlooms could kill was to undermine tradition. Deaths were recorded as fever or sudden illness, never as the result of fabric steeped in years of unwashed filth. By keeping the truth hidden, families protected reputations but allowed the same risks to persist in countless homes. Superstition and pride outweighed practicality, ensuring that dangerous customs survived. The science, though poorly understood at the time, was straightforward. Bodily fluids absorbed into fabric created conditions where bacteria and mould flourished. Locked away in trunks, deprived of ventilation, these materials decomposed into toxic compounds. When disturbed, spores and gases escaped in concentrated form, overwhelming the lungs of those nearby. Yet Victorians lacked the framework to explain this. Instead, they described such tragedies as fate, curses, or divine punishment, reinforcing silence and preventing change. For the women who wore these dresses, the symbolism mattered more than the fabric itself. Washing the gown was seen as a violation, erasing the sacred memory of the wedding. Better to keep it intact, stains and all, than to risk losing what it represented. The price of this devotion fell not on the bride but on the servants years later, those tasked with unfolding the relic when it was needed again. Their exposure was inevitable, but their suffering remained invisible, erased by the demands of tradition. Compared to the way modern families preserve garments through cleaning and careful storage, the Victorian practice of sealing dirty dresses in trunks feels dangerously naive, as though reverence mattered more than survival. This tragedy highlights the class divide embedded in Victorian hygiene. The wealthy had the luxury of storing garments as symbols, while the poor bore the cost of handling them. Servants opened trunks, breathed in the fumes, and risked their lives, all for the sake of preserving an illusion of refinement. Their deaths were never memorialized with the same reverence given to the garments. Instead, they were buried quietly, their labor forgotten as quickly as it had been demanded. I cannot help but feel a deep unease at the thought of these women dying for the sake of fabric, their lives sacrificed to maintain a false sense of purity. Magazines and etiquette manuals perpetuated the silence by praising the preservation of gowns. They spoke of dresses as treasures, instructing women to fold them carefully and never allow water to touch them. They did not warn of the risks, perhaps because admitting them would have undermined the entire culture of reverence. By elevating garments above health, society turned symbols of virtue into tools of slow destruction. The architecture of homes compounded the danger. Damp basements, unventilated attics, and wooden chests created perfect environments for decay. Mold spread across the lace, discolouring it into shades of green and black. Silk stiffened, brittle with embedded stains. When trunks were reopened, the air was thick with spores that clung to lungs and throats. The danger was not a rare accident, but a predictable consequence of the conditions, repeated across households that refused to question their habits. Even as scientific awareness grew, many Victorians clung to tradition. Doctors who warned against storing dirty garments were dismissed as alarmists. Families trusted heritage more than hygiene, believing that what had been done for generations must be safe. This resistance to change ensured that stories of illness and death continued, whispered in kitchens and servants' quarters, but never reached the drawing rooms where decisions were made. The contradiction was sharp. Dresses meant to embody purity carried within them rot and poison. Families who prided themselves on refinement allowed deadly garments to sit in their cupboards. Servants who were tasked with maintaining appearances paid with their health and lives. The silence around these tragedies reveals once again how deeply Victorians valued illusion over reality. Over time, some garments simply disintegrated in their trunks, sparing households from the danger of opening them. Yet the practice of preserving stained gowns remained, passed on as a mark of respectability. The deaths it caused were scattered, forgotten, and hidden, but they formed part of the larger fabric of Victorian life, woven with contradictions and denial. Victorian families cherished unwashed wedding gowns as emblems of purity, yet those same gowns could unleash death when unwrapped years later. The devotion to tradition blinded them to danger, and the burden fell on the servants who paid the price. If even the garments kept for sacred moments could harbour such lethal risks, then the everyday rituals of bathing and cleaning, when carried out with water already tainted and containers already poisoned, brought hazards even more constant and widespread. Bathing in Victorian households was an experience far removed from modern ideas of cleanliness. For families without access to piped water or advanced plumbing, the weekly bath was often a ritual rather than a hygienic necessity. The tub itself was usually made of lead, a material that was heavy, difficult to clean, and dangerous in ways they did not yet understand. Water was heated over fires and poured in by servants, but it cooled quickly, leaving only a short window in which the bath could be called warm. Within minutes, the water grew cloudy as soap, dirt, and body oils mixed together. Instead of being refreshed, each person who bathed after the first carried away more filth than they removed. The order of bathing was dictated by class and hierarchy within the home. The mistress or master entered the tub first, enjoying the brief luxury of warmth and relative cleanliness. Afterward, children and guests might be allowed to use the same water. Finally, the servants were expected to wash in what remained, long after it had turned cold and murky. The very people who handled the dirtiest tasks of the household were forced to bathe in water thick with the residue of others. It is almost laughable that the very act intended to symbolize purity became an exercise in soaking oneself in the accumulated filth of an entire household. The presence of lead in the tubs added a more insidious danger. Prolonged exposure to lead could leach toxins into the water, particularly when heated. Users sometimes complained of stomach aches, fatigue, or skin irritation afterward, but these were rarely linked to the material of the bath itself. Instead, women were told their bodies were delicate or prone to weakness. What might today be recognised as symptoms of lead poisoning were dismissed as ordinary ailments of the time. Compared to modern bathrooms with running hot water and porcelain tubs, the Victorian bath seems not like a luxury but a dangerous compromise. Servants endured the heaviest burden in this ritual. They hauled buckets of water from kitchens or wells, often climbing narrow staircases with heavy loads until the tub was filled. After the family had bathed, They were expected to reuse the same water or sometimes clean the tub without ever bathing at all. When they did climb in, the bath was cold, slimy, and filled with floating hair and soap scum. The indignity of this process underscored their place in the household, where even hygiene was rationed according to class. I find it deeply unsettling to picture exhausted maids washing themselves in water already fouled by others, yet told this was an acceptable form of cleanliness. The bathwater itself became a breeding ground for bacteria. Shared repeatedly within the same family, it passed skin infections, lice, and rashes from person to person. Women with delicate skin often developed sores or fungal infections, made worse by the dampness of undergarments afterward. Yet these outcomes were rarely connected to the bath. Illness was seen as the natural lot of women or children, rather than the predictable result of contaminated water. The silence around hygiene allowed the ritual to continue unchanged, even when its consequences were obvious. Water quality compounded the issue. In urban areas, water was often drawn from sources contaminated with waste. Even before it was poured into the tub, it carried traces of sewage, chemicals, and dirt. Once inside, mixed with soap and sweat, it became a cloudy soup of hazards. Families relied on the visual illusion of soap bubbles to suggest cleanliness, ignoring the fact that each subsequent bather was simply soaking in layers of filth. The architecture of homes revealed the limits of bathing practices. Small bathrooms or improvised spaces meant tubs were often placed in kitchens or bedrooms, without proper drainage. Used water had to be emptied by hand, bucket by bucket, into the yard or down a drain. This back-breaking work discouraged frequent bathing, reinforcing the belief that once a week was more than sufficient. For many, the ritual was as much about appearances as health, proof that a household maintained order rather than a real effort at cleanliness. Even in wealthier homes, where larger tubs and more servants were available, the same customs persisted. Guests might be offered baths, but the water was rarely changed fully between uses. Instead, it was topped up with hot water to disguise how murky it had become. The illusion of luxury masked the underlying truth. Hygiene was sacrificed for convenience and cost. Children grew up in this environment, learning to see the weekly bath as both a duty and a discomfort. They squirmed in the cold water, sometimes crying as parents scolded them for wasting soap. Their bodies were scrubbed harshly with rough cloths or brushes, leaving red marks that added to the misery. The bath was remembered not as a comfort but as a chore, one that offered little protection from the illnesses spreading quietly through damp fabrics and dirty water. Doctors of the period occasionally advised more frequent washing, but their voices were faint compared to the weight of tradition. Families saw no reason to change what had been done for generations. Illness was explained as fate, misfortune, or weakness, never as the logical outcome of unhealthy practices. The culture of silence protected the ritual, ensuring that families continued to gather around the same tub each week, repeating the cycle of contamination. The contradiction was sharp. A society obsessed with refinement and moral purity tolerated baths that were anything but pure. Water thick with dirt and residue was treated as a symbol of civility, while the risks it carried were ignored. The same culture that polished silverware and swept parlours to impress visitors allowed its members to soak in poisonous tubs of lead and filth. Over time, improvements in plumbing and sanitation began to change these habits. But for much of the Victorian period, the weekly lead tub remained central. It was not the luxury it appeared to be, but a practice that reinforced inequality, spread disease, and masked danger under the veil of tradition. Victorian families gathered around a single lead tub, believing themselves cleansed even as they sat in water fouled by others. The ritual reflected their devotion to appearances, not to health. And if the bath itself could carry hidden dangers, the linen spread across beds and used for months without washing held risks that seeped even deeper into daily life. Bed linens in Victorian households were more symbols of wealth and order than instruments of hygiene. Families prized heavy linen sheets for their durability, yet those very qualities made them difficult to wash. Soaking and scrubbing such thick fabric required immense labour, and drying it in damp climates could take days. As a result, most homes limited laundering to a few times a year. In the interim, sheets remained on beds through weeks of use, collecting stains, moisture, and the unspoken traces of bodies that lay upon them night after night. Every night added new layers of filth. Sweat seeped into the fabric, leaving rings of discoloration that darkened over time. Drops of blood from menstruation or small wounds were absorbed, drying into stiff patches that rubbed against the skin. Bodily oils and flakes of dead skin accumulated until the sheets themselves felt heavy. To the eye, they might look merely rumpled, but the fibres teemed with invisible residue. Families covered the smell with sachets of lavender or sprays of perfume, disguising what lay beneath. It is almost absurd to imagine people proud of their tidy bedrooms while lying each night on sheets that had not seen water in months. For women, the consequences were immediate. Their backs and shoulders pressed against damp fabric developed rashes and fungal infections. Some experienced sores that spread slowly, misdiagnosed as weakness or poor constitution. Few connected these ailments to their bedding. Instead, they applied ointments or powders, layering more chemicals onto already irritated skin. The silence surrounding hygiene made it easier to blame the body than to confront the reality of unwashed linens. Servants bore the brunt of this system. They were tasked with handling sheets saturated with filth, shaking them out each morning to air them near windows or fires. In the process, they inhaled dust and spores, exposing themselves to respiratory infections. Washing days were dreaded, requiring boiling water, harsh scrubbing, and wringing fabric so heavy it could strain muscles. Yet even after this effort, families limited how often the work was done, valuing efficiency over health. Compared to the ease of tossing modern bedding into a machine weekly, the Victorian reluctance to wash sheets feels both impractical and shockingly careless. The architecture of homes worsened the problem. Bedrooms were often poorly ventilated, trapping moisture inside. Curtains froze to windows in winter, leaving rooms damp year-round. Sheets never fully dried between uses, remaining slightly clammy, a perfect host for mould. Guests in wealthier homes sometimes remarked on musty odours, but politeness kept them silent. To question a hostess's linens would have been a social offence, so the cycle continued unquestioned. I cannot help but feel disturbed at the thought of people slipping under covers that reeked of age, believing themselves refined while lying in slow rot. The illusion of refinement extended to decorative choices. Beds were adorned with lace covers and embroidered cases, drawing attention to beauty rather than cleanliness. Visitors admired appearances, never suspecting the filth woven into the fabric beneath. Families maintained this illusion deliberately, confident that as long as sheets looked presentable from afar, no one would ask questions. Health remained secondary to appearances. Children grew up in these conditions, sleeping in cribs or small beds covered with the same neglected fabrics. Their small bodies were especially vulnerable to infections carried in the fibres. Fevers and coughs spread quickly among siblings sharing beds, yet parents attributed these illnesses to chance or weak bloodlines. Rarely did they consider the damp sheets their children breathed against every night. Doctors of the period occasionally described outbreaks of skin conditions or unexplained fevers among women. They sometimes hinted at the role of bedding, but avoided naming it outright. To accuse respectable families of neglect was to risk offence. Instead, they prescribed tonics or ointments, reinforcing the silence that allowed the problem to persist. In this way, medical language protected appearances while ignoring the root causes. Wealth did not guarantee safety. Even in grand houses, sheets were washed infrequently, since laundering was equally laborious. The only difference was the quality of fabric, softer linen or silk that still absorbed filth just as thoroughly. These sheets, wrapped in embroidery and lace, looked more refined but carried the same risks. In both rich and poor homes, women endured the consequences silently, their suffering explained away as part of the natural order. The contradiction was glaring. Victorian society celebrated purity and refinement, yet tolerated beds that were, in truth, breeding grounds for disease. People spoke of dignity while lying in linens stained with blood and sweat. They displayed elegance while hiding mildew and mould in their cupboards. What mattered was not health, but the maintenance of illusion, even if that illusion spread misery to every member of the household. Over time, the odour itself became normalised. Families no longer noticed the musty smell, accepting it as the natural scent of home. Only when guests remarked did they sprinkle more perfume or herbs, addressing the symptom rather than the cause. In this way, sheets became both a necessity and a silent hazard, as dangerous as any other object in the Victorian household. Victorian beds held linens that were washed only when the smell became unbearable, their fibres saturated with months of sweat, blood, and mould. Women bore the consequences in rashes and infections, while families clung to appearances instead of health. And if beds could conceal such hazards, then death itself sometimes revealed the truth, when illness traced back not to chance, but to the very sheets that seemed symbols of domestic comfort. Stories of death tied to something as ordinary as a bedsheet might seem exaggerated, yet in the Victorian world, they were entirely possible. Linens were not merely pieces of fabric, but objects that carried years of residue, often passed from one generation to the next. Families prized them as heirlooms, keeping them in constant use long after stains and odours revealed their true condition. A bedsheet with faint yellow or brown marks was not considered unclean but simply aged. When these sheets were spread on beds once again, they became invisible hazards, pressing decades of accumulated filth against human skin. One tragic account told of a lady of a high standing who fell ill after a seemingly minor scratch on her hand. The wound was small, but the sheet on which she slept carried mould and bacteria embedded deep in the fibres. Night after night, the cut pressed against damp linen that smelled faintly of age. Within days, the skin around the wound grew red and swollen. Fever followed, rising steadily until her body could no longer resist. Doctors puzzled over the case, unable to trace the infection until they examined her bedding. Only then did they realise the sheets were mottled with stains and mildew, relics of use that had never been properly washed. It is almost grotesque to imagine a woman praised for refinement lying in luxury sheets that were, in truth, breeding grounds for her death. The reluctance to replace or clean such linens was rooted in tradition. Families valued continuity, using the same sheets their parents and grandparents had slept on. The weight of history outweighed the question of hygiene. To discard an heirloom was seen as wasteful or even disrespectful. So the fabric remained in circulation, patched when torn, folded when stained, always preserved as part of the household's legacy. In this way, families embraced danger under the guise of reverence. Servants once again bore the closest contact with these linens. They aired them by windows, beat them to remove dust, and spread them back on beds. In doing so, they inhaled spores and handled fibres embedded with sweat and blood from years past. Illness among maids was common, but no one blamed the sheets. Instead, their weakness was attributed to hard work or poor breeding. Compared to today, when old linens are discarded without hesitation, the Victorian insistence on reusing mouldy sheets feels astonishingly careless. Doctors confronted with such deaths rarely spoke directly about the role of bedding. To blame a household's linens was to accuse respectable families of neglect, a charge that could ruin reputations. Instead, they recorded vague causes of death like fever or decline. The truth remained buried alongside the victim, leaving others to continue sleeping on the same dangerous fabrics. I find it unsettling to think of entire families lying in beds layered with history, unaware that the same cloth that comforted their ancestors was slowly poisoning them. The environment of Victorian bedrooms encouraged decay. Heavy curtains trapped dampness, windows were rarely opened, and fireplaces gave little warmth to the corners of the room. Sheets remained clammy even after being aired, allowing mould to spread invisibly. Guests who stayed overnight sometimes remarked on the musty smell, but politeness kept them silent. No one wanted to insult their hosts by pointing out that their hospitality was offered on bedding already contaminated with disease. The lady who died after scratching her hand was not an isolated case. Similar infections occurred frequently, though they were explained away as accidents or weakness. The scratches could come from jewellery, sewing needles, or even rough furniture. Once exposed to contaminated fabric, the wounds became gateways for deadly bacteria. Staphylococcus infection spread quickly, and without modern antibiotics, recovery was rare. Families grieved without ever realizing that the hazard lay not in fate, but in the sheets they had chosen to preserve. The contradiction was sharp. These linens symbolized continuity and tradition, yet they carried hidden dangers that undermined the very lives they were meant to protect. Families clung to them as marks of stability, while the mould within their fibres spread silently. The respectability they embodied was built on denial, as if the appearance of history could outweigh the demands of health. Over time, the cycle repeated. Sheets were folded after deaths, stored again, and eventually brought back out for younger generations. Few questioned why fevers lingered in certain households, or why infections spread so quickly. The silence of doctors and families alike ensured that the truth was never spoken. In this way, the danger of mouldy sheets became part of the fabric of Victorian life, woven into the same silence that cloaked so many of their unhygienic customs. The story of the lady's death reflects the larger theme of Victorian hygiene. Appearances triumphed over reality, tradition outweighed health, and silence allowed danger to thrive. What was praised as devotion to legacy was, in truth, neglect disguised as refinement. Families polished silver and swept parlours to impress guests, yet laid them on sheets saturated with rot. Victorian homes treasured old linens as symbols of respect, yet these very fabrics carried infection into bedrooms. A single scratch was enough to bring death when pressed against mouldy fibres night after night, and if the cloth that touched the skin could be so deadly, the pillows and blankets stuffed with untreated materials posed threats no less severe, turning nightly rest into a constant risk. Pillows and blankets in Victorian homes were not the soft comforts we imagine today, but heavy, crude objects stuffed with untreated animal hair or straw. The filling was chosen for its availability and affordability, not for safety. Horsehair, in particular, was prized for its firmness, yet it often carried with it the smell of the stable, an odour that clung to bedding no matter how carefully it was covered. Straw, too, was common, bundled tightly into sacks that served as mattresses or layered into quilts. These materials offered bulk and warmth, but they also introduced parasites, dust, and spores directly into the places where families sought rest. Each night, as bodies pressed against the bedding, small particles were released into the air. The simple act of adjusting a pillow or blanket caused clouds of fine dust to rise, settling on skin and filling lungs. Over time, the fibres themselves broke down, producing even more residue. Families grew accustomed to the sensation of tickling throats and runny noses, considering them normal parts of sleep. The true source of these irritations remained unspoken, hidden behind the silence that marked so much of Victorian domestic life. It is almost grimly amusing to imagine people congratulating themselves on refinement while laying their heads on pillows that smelled of stables and shed clouds of parasites at every touch. Children suffered most under these conditions. Their smaller bodies were more sensitive to the allergens and irritants released from bedding. Cases of chronic cough, wheezing, and persistent skin rashes were common in nurseries filled with straw-stuffed mattresses. Yet parents saw these ailments as part of childhood, not as the predictable result of what their children slept on each night. Doctors, too, avoided naming bedding as the culprit, preferring vague terms like constitutional weakness. Compared to the sterile, mass-produced bedding of today, the Victorian reliance on untreated horsehair and straw feels like a deliberate invitation to illness. The smell of bedding was another problem. Even after coverings were added, pillows and blankets retained the scent of animals. Sweat and moisture from nightly use intensified the odour, producing a heavy, musty atmosphere in bedrooms. Families tried to disguise it with sachets of lavender or sprigs of herbs tucked into cases, but the smell always returned. Guests might notice but would never speak of it openly, for to comment on another household's bedding was considered impolite. Servants once again faced the worst of these conditions. They handled the bedding daily, fluffing pillows and shaking out blankets to prepare rooms. In doing so, they released clouds of dust and spores. Breathing them deeply, many developed chronic coughs or skin conditions, yet their suffering was ignored. They were expected to endure, as their labour was framed as duty rather than health risk. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining young maids inhaling the decay of horsehair day after day, slowly wearing down their lungs in the name of refinement. Parasites thrived in these materials. Lice and fleas burrowed into the stuffing, feeding on the warmth and the traces of blood and sweat that seeped in over time. Blankets that looked intact from the outside often teemed with invisible infestations. Families itched through nights without ever connecting the cause to the objects around them. Instead, they blamed the poor or outsiders for spreading vermin, ignoring the truth that their own bedding carried the infestation directly into their homes. The weight of these blankets added to the discomfort. Heavy with straw or hair, they pressed down on sleepers, trapping heat and moisture. Instead of offering comfort, they created a humid environment perfect for mold. Spots of mildew appeared on fabric covers, darkening over time, yet were often dismissed as harmless. Families continued to use them, convinced that the bulk and weight were proof of quality. The contradiction was stark. Homes decorated with fine curtains and polished furniture still housed bedding that reeked of decay and bred infection. The very rooms presented as symbols of refinement became, in truth, breeding grounds for illness. This was not an accident, but a deliberate silence, a refusal to confront the reality of what tradition demanded. Medical observations occasionally mentioned the connection. Doctors noted that children raised on straw mattresses often developed respiratory issues, yet these remarks were buried in reports that avoided offending respectable families. Without clear condemnation, the practices endured. Bedding was expensive to replace, and so families chose to ignore the risks, keeping their heirloom pillows and blankets long after they should have been discarded. Over time, the dust and odour became normalised. Families ceased to notice the smell, much as they ignored the discomfort of constant coughing or sneezing. The silence was so complete that bedding stuffed with animal remains became part of the identity of Victorian homes, accepted as natural despite the suffering it caused. Victorian pillows and blankets were not comforts but carriers of filth, parasites, and mould, spreading illness each night under the guise of tradition. Families believed themselves refined as they lay beneath them, while children coughed and servants sickened. And if bedding could carry such hidden dangers, then the very bodies of women themselves, left unshaven and powdered rather than cleaned, held risks no less unsettling. Body hair in Victorian society was treated very differently from how it is today. The expectation for women was not to shave or remove it, but to leave it untouched, regarded as a natural part of the body. Shaving was associated with the practices of men or with people outside respectable circles, and so women were instructed to accept their hair as it grew, under layers of heavy skirts, petticoats, and corsets. Hair was hidden from public sight, and that concealment gave license to ignore it. Yet the decision to leave hair untrimmed brought with it consequences that were rarely spoken of. consequences that touched health, comfort, and dignity in ways that were kept carefully silent. Hair beneath the arms and along the legs trapped sweat easily. The thick fabrics of Victorian dress restricted airflow, making these areas damp and warm. Women powdered their bodies daily to disguise odour, sprinkling alum, borax, or even powdered lead onto the skin and over the hair. Instead of refreshing the body, the powders clumped together with sweat and oils, clogging follicles and irritating skin. Infections of the hair follicles were common, leaving women with sore, inflamed patches beneath their arms or along their thighs. It is almost laughable to imagine that the same women praised for elegance walked about with painful rashes simply because society told them it was virtuous to leave their bodies untouched. The discomfort was compounded by layers of clothing. Stockings and multiple underskirts rubbed constantly against hairy legs, creating friction that irritated already sensitive skin. Moisture was trapped between the fabric and the body, allowing fungal infections to flourish. Women described itching and redness but attributed it to weak health or climate rather than to the conditions of their own bodies. Powder was applied again as a solution, disguising the smell while worsening the irritation. Compared to modern grooming habits and breathable fabrics, the Victorian custom of hiding hair and layering powders over it seems more like a ritual of suffering than of refinement. For servants and poorer women, the problem was magnified. They wore their clothing for longer periods, often without access to fresh linens. Their labour demanded movement, which increased sweating, especially in confined clothing. Without the means to change garments frequently or to buy powders, they endured constant discomfort. Servants who did have access to powders were exposed to the same risks of poisoning from lead or borax, inhaling dust daily as they tried to mask odours their mistresses would not tolerate. I find it unsettling to imagine young maids lifting heavy skirts to sprinkle powder under their arms, not to soothe themselves, but to meet the expectations of households that measured them by scent rather than well-being. The cultural framing of hair as natural was bound tightly to ideas of morality. To remove it would have been considered immodest, as though acknowledging the body's needs was indecent. Respectable women were expected to remain ignorant of such things. Their silence maintained the illusion of purity, even when their bodies suffered in private. This silence also extended to medicine. Doctors wrote vaguely of skin irritations and infections, but avoided naming the role of hair or hygiene practices. To do so would have meant confronting the contradiction at the heart of Victorian respectability. Children grew up in households where such practices were passed down as normal. Girls saw their mothers apply powder under layers of clothing and learned to repeat the ritual themselves. They were told nothing of hair removal, nor were they taught to question discomfort. Infections and rashes became accepted parts of womanhood, explained away as feminine fragility. This generational silence ensured that the same problems continued unchecked, hidden behind petticoats and propriety. The contradiction between appearance and reality was striking. Outwardly, Victorian women were praised for their elegance, purity, and restraint. Inwardly, they dealt with discomfort, odour, and infection that no one dared name. The body became a site of suffering hidden beneath layers of lace and silk. Powder and perfume offered the illusion of control, but neither solved the problems that lay beneath. This was Victorian life in miniature appearances preserved at all costs, truth concealed in silence. Medical consequences could be severe. Infections of the follicles sometimes spread, leading to abscesses that required draining. Some women developed chronic fungal conditions, particularly beneath the breasts and arms, where moisture and powder combined. Without antibiotics or antifungal medicines, these conditions lingered for months or years. The pain was endured quietly, treated at home with herbs or ointments, but never spoken of openly. Death from such infections was rare but not impossible, particularly when bacteria entered the bloodstream through broken skin. Even in wealthier households, with access to finer fabrics and imported powders, the same issues persisted. Silk and satin trapped sweat as effectively as wool or cotton, and the expensive powders still contained toxic chemicals. The difference was only in appearance, elegant packaging on jars and perfumed scents to disguise the same harmful substances. Refinement was measured by what could be seen and smelled, not by the actual health of the body beneath. Over time, the normalization of these practices shaped how women were perceived. Their discomfort was reinterpreted as delicacy, their illnesses as fragility. The very suffering caused by neglect became proof of the stereotype society imposed upon them. This circular logic ensured that the system sustained itself, even as it harmed generation after generation. The role of men in this silence cannot be overlooked. Husbands and fathers expected their wives and daughters to embody purity, yet they contributed to the very conditions that harmed them. They demanded layers of clothing, frowned upon discussion of hygiene, and measured virtue by ignorance. If women suffered in silence, it was because silence had been demanded of them. The resilience of women within these conditions is remarkable. They endured daily discomfort and chronic infections while presenting faces of composure in public. They balanced the demands of fashion, tradition, and health without complaint, maintaining households while their own needs remained unmet. Yet this endurance came at a cost, one that history often overlooks when celebrating Victorian refinement. The persistence of body hair, untreated and powdered, symbolizes more than a hygiene habit. It represents the wider Victorian tendency to conceal truth behind appearances, to prioritize propriety over reality. Just as homes displayed polished furniture while hiding chamber pots, women displayed elegance while hiding infections. In both cases, silence preserved the illusion, even as it allowed harm to continue. Victorian women left their hair unshaven, powdered their bodies daily, and endured infections as if they were natural. Their discomfort was hidden beneath layers of clothing and layers of silence, accepted as the cost of respectability. Yet if the body itself carried such hazards, the products meant to mask those hazards, such as perfume sold cheaply and adulterated with toxic chemicals, exposed women to even more shocking dangers. Perfume in Victorian society was more than a luxury. It was a mask, a way to cover the odours that clung to bodies and garments in an age when daily washing was rare. Bottles sat on dressing tables, ornate in their design, suggesting refinement and wealth. To own perfume was to signal not only elegance but also respectability. Women sprinkled it on their wrists, dabbed it on their collars, and misted it over hair and clothing. It was considered essential in polite society, a finishing touch before entering the drawing room or attending a ball. Yet beneath the glamour lay a danger few anticipated, for the contents of those bottles were not always what they seemed. Perfume production in the 19th century was poorly regulated. While luxury houses produced expensive blends with imported oils and carefully distilled alcohol, a growing market for cheaper perfumes meant that countless bottles were mixed and sold by less reputable merchants. These sellers catered to the middle classes and servants who longed for the refinement of their social superiors but could not afford genuine imports. Their solutions were simple: dilute expensive ingredients with cheaper substitutes, or replace them altogether with industrial chemicals. Methanol, known as wood alcohol, became one of the most dangerous shortcuts. Methanol looked and smelled much like ethanol, the alcohol normally used in perfume. But while ethanol was costly, methanol was cheap and plentiful, used in industrial applications like cleaning and fuel. When blended into perfume, it carried fragrance just as well. The difference was revealed only later, when it touched human skin and eyes. Methanol was highly toxic, capable of causing blindness and even death when absorbed in sufficient quantities. Yet to the eager customer, there was no warning, no label, and no difference visible in the sparkling liquid inside the glass vial. Victorian women trusted these perfumes to guard them against embarrassment. In a society where body odour was considered a moral failing, scent was more than a pleasure, it was protection. To appear in company without the veil of perfume was to risk shame, whispers, and exclusion. So women sprayed liberally, often reapplying throughout the day, particularly during the stifling summer months. They misted their necks, their faces, even their hair, unaware that each droplet might carry poison. It is bitterly ironic that the very solution to hiding odour was, in some cases, more dangerous than the odour itself. The reports that emerged from cases of methanol poisoning were harrowing. Women who applied perfume to their faces began to experience stinging in their eyes, followed by blurred vision. Within hours or days, some were blinded permanently. Doctors struggled to explain the sudden wave of cases, linking them only after noticing that the women had purchased perfume from the same vendors. The numbers were not small. In one documented cluster, 14 women were left blind in just 2 weeks, their lives altered forever by what they thought was a symbol of elegance. Reading of such tragedies, one cannot help but think of how modern consumers, too, can fall victim to counterfeit products that promise beauty but deliver harm. The social impact of such cases was profound. A woman blinded by perfume faced not only physical disability, but also social ruin. Marriage prospects evaporated, employment became impossible, and in some cases, families distanced themselves out of shame. Disability was rarely accommodated in Victorian society, and women who lost their sight often lived in isolation or dependence. Their suffering was compounded by silence, for families rarely admitted the true cause. To say that blindness came from a bottle of cheap perfume was to confess to poverty, vanity, and poor judgment all at once. Instead, alternate stories were invented, leaving the victims doubly erased first by their condition, then by the loss of their truth. Merchants responsible for selling such products often escaped accountability. Regulations were few, and enforcement was weaker still. Street vendors simply vanished when accusations arose, only to reappear later under new names. Even larger apothecaries, eager to cut costs, were known to sell adulterated goods, hiding behind polished storefronts and reputations. Customers lacked the means to challenge them. Doctors might suspect contamination, but without clear evidence, little could be done. It was easier for society to blame the women themselves than to confront the broader corruption in trade. Meanwhile, the demand for perfume only grew. As industrial cities expanded, air thick with smoke and sewage made scent even more desirable. The stronger the odour of the streets, the more heavily women perfumed their bodies to defend against it. This rising dependence created a fertile ground for exploitation. Cheap perfumes promised an escape from foul environments, but delivered yet another layer of harm. Women's bodies became the battleground, caught between the dirt of the city and the poison of counterfeit bottles. What is striking is how little these dangers disrupted the culture of perfume. Even as stories circulated of blindness, women continued to apply scent, convinced that their own bottles were safe. The alternative was unthinkable. To appear without perfume was to risk exclusion. Respectability was measured by smell as much as by dress, and without perfume, a woman felt naked in society. This desperation to conform outweighed even the possibility of harm. It seems almost absurd that a civilization so obsessed with propriety tolerated poisons at its vanity tables. But then, the Victorians were masters at ignoring contradictions. Personal accounts reveal the fear that lingered in households after such incidents. Women whispered about the dangers, yet continued to use perfumes, rationalizing that their suppliers were trustworthy. Some resorted to older remedies, dabbing rosewater or lavender oil instead of commercial blends. Though these were less effective and carried their own risks of spoilage, others limited perfume to clothing rather than skin, though even fabric absorbed methanol vapors. No solution was safe, only safer, and every choice carried a degree of risk that women endured quietly. The broader symbolism of this practice cannot be ignored. Perfume, meant to represent refinement, exposed the fragility of Victorian ideals. The obsession with appearances, pure faces, fragrant bodies, and unblemished reputations left women vulnerable to dangers hidden in the very tools of that appearance. Respectability was pursued at any cost, even at the expense of health. Behind each ornate bottle lay the possibility of ruin, but to reject it was to reject society itself. In the end, stories of blindness from counterfeit perfume remind us of the cruelty of Victorian standards. Women were expected to maintain appearances at all costs, yet were given no tools to ensure their safety. They bore the consequences of a culture that valued image over truth, scent over health. Their suffering was folded into silence, dismissed as misfortune, while the system that enabled it continued unchallenged. Victorian women sought purity through fragrance, but fragrance betrayed them. The perfume that promised elegance delivered blindness, shame, and loss. This tragedy was not an accident, but the product of a society that demanded beauty while disregarding the dangers of how it was achieved. And if perfume could rob women of their sight, the silence surrounding diseases of the body left them just as vulnerable to lifelong suffering, unspoken and untreated. Gynecological illness in Victorian society was among the most silenced of subjects. Women were expected to embody purity and modesty, and speaking openly about their private bodies violated those ideals. If discomfort, pain, or unusual discharge appeared, the woman was far more likely to endure it quietly than to seek medical help. To admit that something was wrong in such an intimate area invited suspicion. It was assumed that women who suffered gynecological problems must have behaved improperly, even when the true cause was as ordinary as infection, childbirth complications, or poor hygiene. In this way, silence became the rule, and countless women suffered untreated. Household remedies were often the only recourse. Women used herbs, poultices, or powders to address symptoms without naming them. Chamomile, lavender, and vinegar were applied in makeshift washes. Talc powders, often laced with unsafe chemicals, were sprinkled to mask odours and moisture. These remedies rarely treated the root causes of infections, but they provided the illusion of control. Families accepted them because they preserved discretion. A woman who sought stronger treatment from a doctor risked exposure, gossip, and disgrace. The unspoken message was clear: better to suffer quietly than to risk shame. It is a cruel irony that society considered silence more respectable than health, as though ignorance were a badge of honour. The medical establishment offered little relief. Physicians avoided discussing women's intimate conditions unless absolutely necessary. When called upon, they often described symptoms vaguely, using euphemisms that concealed more than they revealed. Notes recorded general weakness or nervous disorders instead of infections or inflammations. This language reflected not only discomfort but also a refusal to challenge cultural taboos. Doctors themselves risked reputational harm if they appeared too interested in such matters, so they played their part in maintaining silence. Compared to modern gynecology, where open discussion is encouraged for prevention and treatment, the Victorian refusal to name the truth feels more like abandonment than modesty. The physical consequences were severe. Many women lived with chronic pain, recurring fevers, or foul-smelling discharges for years. Some conditions worsened into life-threatening infections, spreading into the bloodstream. Others caused infertility or complications during childbirth, outcomes that were devastating in a society where motherhood defined female worth. Yet these tragedies rarely appeared in official records. Deaths were attributed to exhaustion, decline, or vague ailments rather than acknowledged as the results of preventable disease. Families buried not only their loved ones, but also the truth of what had happened to them. Servants and poorer women faced even greater dangers. They lacked access to clean facilities, proper laundry, or even adequate undergarments. The heavy wool and linen they wore trapped moisture, creating an ideal environment for infections. Without money for doctors or remedies, they relied on superstition and whispered advice. Many were told to endure their suffering as part of womanhood, and so they did, while continuing to labour in households that demanded their strength without acknowledging their pain. I cannot help but feel disturbed at how easily their health was sacrificed, dismissed as unworthy of attention compared to the preservation of appearances. The silence around gynecological illness reflected the larger Victorian obsession with purity. Women were told to embody innocence, to avoid even thinking of the physical aspects of their own bodies. Education never addressed anatomy or sexual health, so girls entered adulthood without the knowledge to recognize danger. A discharge might be dismissed as weakness, a fever as fatigue, when in fact they were signs of infection. Ignorance was framed as virtue, but in practice, it was a weapon that left women defenseless. The taboo was reinforced by religion and morality. Clergy warned women against curiosity, framing bodily knowledge as temptation. Wives were told to obey, to endure, and to keep silent. Even mothers hesitated to share information with daughters, fearing that openness would tarnish their virtue. In such a culture, secrecy passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that the same mistakes and sufferings were repeated. The cycle of silence became as entrenched as the illnesses themselves. Despite the silence, some traces of women's suffering remain in private letters, diaries, and medical archives. There are accounts of women bedridden for weeks with unexplained fevers, of wives abandoned by husbands after developing female troubles, of servants dismissed quietly when their conditions became visible. These fragments reveal the scale of the problem that public discourse worked so hard to erase. They also remind us that behind the polished surface of Victorian respectability lay hidden rooms of anguish. The greatest tragedy is that many of these conditions were treatable. Even in the 19th century, basic hygiene, antiseptics, and rest could have saved countless women from lifelong pain or premature death. But treatment required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required breaking the silence. Victorian society chose the opposite path, preferring ignorance to truth, reputation to health. The result was a century in which women carried invisible burdens that history only partially records. The irony cannot be overlooked. A culture that proclaimed itself the height of morality created conditions where preventable disease flourished unchecked. Women were expected to preserve their purity, yet purity left them vulnerable to infection. They were praised for silence, yet silence ensured their suffering. In the end, the obsession with virtue concealed a reality of neglect and pain. It is almost darkly comical that a society so proud of its progress failed so completely at the basic task of caring for half its population. As we reflect on these hidden histories, it becomes clear that the story of Victorian hygiene is not merely about dirt, disease, or neglect. It is about the values that shaped those conditions, the silence that sustained them, and the lives that were lost because of them. It reminds us that standards of respectability can sometimes be more dangerous than any germ, and that the price of maintaining appearances is often paid in suffering unseen. Victorian women endured these burdens quietly, their health sacrificed for ideals they had no power to question. Their stories, when pieced together, reveal not just the failings of a medical system, but the cruelty of a culture that prized purity over truth. To remember them is to confront the darker side of a century too often romanticized for its refinement and progress. Victorian life promised dignity and grace, but behind closed doors it delivered silence, shame, and needless suffering. Women bore illnesses alone, their voices stifled by fear of disgrace. This silence was as deadly as any disease, leaving behind a legacy of pain hidden beneath the lace and velvet of the era. Now, as this story draws to a close, it is worth pausing to honour those forgotten women whose voices were never heard. Their struggles remind us of the importance of truth, openness, and compassion in matters of health and dignity. Thank you for staying with this dark journey through Victorian hygiene, where every detail revealed a world that was far less refined than its image suggested. May the lessons of their silence remind us to listen more carefully today. Good night, and may you rest easier than the women who endured so much in that unforgiving age.